The stagecoach door swung open, and Eleanor McKenna stepped into the Wyoming dust, her copper hair blazing like wildfire in the afternoon sun. Wilfred Hargrave took one look at her flaming locks and recoiled as if struck by lightning. "Devil's mark," he spat, backing away from his mail-order bride. The entire town of Willow Creek watched as he publicly rejected the woman who'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry him. But from the crowd, a lone cowboy's voice rang out. "That hair burns brighter than the sun itself. If you want to know how rejection became redemption, stay with me until the end, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story has reached." The Wyoming territory stretched endlessly beneath a merciless August sun, its prairies rippling like golden waves frozen in time. The stagecoach lurched and groaned along the rutted trail toward Willow Creek, each jolt sending Eleanor McKenna's stomach into fresh knots of anxiety. She pressed her gloved hand against the small leather pouch containing her mother's cameo brooch, the last piece of home she carried with her across 2,000 miles of American frontier. "Almost there, miss," the driver called down, his voice gravelly from trail dust. "Willow Creek's just over that rise." Eleanor smoothed her travel-worn dress, a practical navy wool that had seemed so sophisticated in Boston, but now felt heavy and foreign against the wild openness of Wyoming. Her fingers hesitated at her bonnet strings. Should she keep it tied tight, hiding what she knew would cause whispers? Or should she face her future husband exactly as she was? The decision was made for her when the stagecoach hit a particularly violent rut, sending her bonnet tumbling to the floor. Her hair, carefully pinned that morning, came loose in a cascade of copper fire that caught the sunlight streaming through the coach window. She'd spent 23 years learning to manage reactions to her coloring. The stares, the superstitious crossing of hearts, the old women who clutched their crosses when she passed. But Wilfred Hargrave's letters had been different. They'd spoken of practicality, of building something solid in this new land. He needed a wife who could work hard, who wasn't afraid of isolation, who could bring some Eastern refinement to his expanding mercantile business. He'd never asked about her appearance, only about her skills. Could she keep books? Could she cook for ranch hands? Could she teach children their letters when the time came? "Yes," she had written back to each question, her pen steady despite her racing heart. "Yes, I can do all of that and more." The stagecoach crested the hill, and Willow Creek spread before her like a child's toy town scattered across the valley. False-fronted buildings lined the main street, their raw lumber still pale and unweathered. Smoke rose from chimneys despite the heat, and she could see figures moving between the buildings, her future neighbors, perhaps her future friends. "Whoa there!" The driver pulled the team to a stop in front of the Frontier Hotel, a two-story establishment that seemed to lean slightly to the left, as if the Wyoming wind had been pushing it for years. A crowd had gathered, word traveled fast in a town of 300 souls, and a mail-order bride was entertainment enough to draw folks from their daily business. Eleanor's heart hammered against her corset stays as she gathered her courage. Through the dusty window, she could see him. Wilfred Hargrave stood apart from the crowd, his black suit impeccable despite the heat, his watch chain glinting in the sun. He was older than she'd imagined, perhaps 45 to her 23, with graying temples and a thin mustache waxed to sharp points. His bearing was rigid, proper, everything a successful merchant should be. She descended from the coach with as much grace as her shaking legs would allow. The crowd parted, creating a path between her and her intended. The silence was complete save for the creak of leather and the distant sound of a hammer striking iron. Someone was still working despite the spectacle. Wilfred stepped forward, and Eleanor saw the exact moment his expression changed. His eyes, which had held cautious welcome, went wide with something between horror and rage. His gaze fixed on her hair, now fully visible as her bonnet hung useless in her hand. The sun chose that moment to break from behind a cloud, setting her copper locks ablaze with light. "No," he said, the word dropping like a stone into still water. "Absolutely not." Eleanor's smile faltered. "Mr. Hargrave? I'm Eleanor McKenna. I know who you claim to be," he interrupted, his voice rising with each word. "But you're not the woman I corresponded with." That woman never mentioned she bore the devil's mark. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her dizzy in the afternoon heat. "I beg your pardon?" "Red hair," Wilfred spat the words as if they tasted foul. "The mark of witchcraft, of moral corruption. My mother warned me about women like you, temptresses who lead good men to ruin." "Mr. Hargrave," Eleanor's voice remained steady, though her hands trembled. "We've exchanged 23 letters. You know my character, my intentions. How can the color of my hair change? It changes everything." He backed away from her as if she carried plague. "You deceived me. Deliberately withheld this aberration. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I'd be so desperate for a wife that I'd accept damaged goods?" The crowd pressed closer, their whispers rising like wind through wheat. Eleanor stood alone in the circle of their judgment, her trunk at her feet, her entire future crumbling with each word from Wilfred's thin lips. "I've dissolved partnerships for less deception than this," he continued, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Consider our arrangement null and void. I'll not have you in my house, in my bed, or in my business. Find your own way back to wherever you came from." "I sold everything to come here," Eleanor said quietly, though her words carried in the still air. "My parents' furniture, their books, even my mother's wedding dress. I have $17 to my name and nowhere to— That's no concern of mine." Wilfred turned on his heel, then paused to deliver one final blow. "Let this be a lesson to all you young ladies considering correspondence marriages. Honesty in all things, or face the consequences of your deception." He strode away, his back rigid with self-righteousness, leaving Eleanor standing in the dust with her trunk and her shattered dreams. The crowd began to murmur more openly now, some with sympathy, others with the cruel satisfaction of witnessing someone else's misfortune. "Red-headed witch," someone whispered. "Serves her right for lying," another added. "My grandmother always said copper hair meant copper morals." Eleanor lifted her chin, though tears threatened to spill. She would not cry, not here, not before these strangers who seemed to feast on her humiliation. She bent to grasp her trunk handle, though the weight of it seemed impossible now. "Let me." The voice was deep, steady, and came from directly behind her. A large, work-roughened hand reached past her to grab the trunk handle, lifting it as if it weighed nothing at all. Eleanor turned to find herself looking up at the broadest shoulders she'd ever seen, encased in a simple cotton shirt rolled to the elbows. The man's face was weathered by sun and wind, making his age difficult to determine, perhaps 30, perhaps younger. His hair was dark as coal, his jaw square and strong, and his eyes were the color of sage honey, warm and kind, and utterly unafraid as they met hers. "Daniel Ryder," he said simply. "I run the blacksmith shop at the end of town. This trunk needs to go to the hotel, I'm guessing." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. "Don't mind Hargrave," Daniel said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Man's afraid of his own shadow most days. Probably did you a favor, showing his true colors before you were legally bound to him." "A favor?" Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. "I'm stranded in a town where apparently my hair marks me as a witch." Daniel's laugh was rich and genuine. "Miss, I've been in Willow Creek for 7 years. I've seen folks claim witchcraft over everything from twins being born to milk souring in August heat. Your hair—" He paused, and she saw something flicker in those honey eyes. "Your hair is beautiful, like sunrise over the prairie. Any man who can't see that is a fool." The crowd began to disperse, robbed of further spectacle by Daniel's casual dismissal of their prejudices. He hefted her trunk onto his shoulder with ease and began walking toward the hotel. Eleanor had no choice but to follow, her legs moving automatically while her mind reeled. The hotel lobby was dim and cool after the blazing sun outside. A stern-faced woman in widow's black stood behind the desk, her gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her features. "Mrs. Patterson," Daniel said with easy familiarity, "this is Miss McKenna. She'll be needing a room." "I saw what happened." Mrs. Patterson's voice was crisp, but not unkind. "Wilfred Hargrave's a fool, but his money spends as good as anyone's. You have funds for lodging, miss?" "I have $17, Eleanor admitted, her cheeks burning with shame. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. That'll cover a week, meals included. After that? After that, she'll have figured something out, Daniel interjected. Eleanor, may I call you Eleanor, is obviously resourceful. She made it all the way from Boston, didn't she? Eleanor looked at this stranger who spoke her name as if they were old friends, who defended her to the crowd, and now to this stern hotel keeper. How did you know I was from Boston? Your accent, he said with a small smile. Plus, Hargrave's been boasting about his Boston bride for 2 months. Man couldn't shut up about the refined Eastern lady who was going to civilize his household. The smile turned slightly wicked. Bet he's regretting all that public preening right about now. Despite everything, Eleanor felt her lips twitch toward a smile. I suppose he is. Daniel Ryder, Mrs. Patterson cut in sharply. Don't you have horses waiting to be shod? They can wait an hour more, he replied easily. Miss McKenna's had a trying day. Least I can do is see her settled properly. He turned to Eleanor. Have you eaten? The hotel dining room serves a decent steak, and I'm buying. I couldn't possibly. You could, and you will, he said firmly. Consider it a welcome gift from one of Willow Creek's few reasonable citizens. Before Eleanor could protest further, he was guiding her toward the dining room with a gentle hand at her elbow. The room held a scattering of round tables covered in checkered cloths, and the smell of beef and fresh bread made her stomach clench with sudden hunger. She hadn't eaten since the way station at dawn, too nervous about meeting Wilfred to manage more than weak coffee and a stale biscuit. Daniel pulled out a chair for her, an unexpected courtesy in this rough town, and took the seat across from her. His presence seemed to fill the space, not just physically, but with an easy confidence that made the curious stares from other diners slide away like water. 2 steaks, Martha, he called to the woman who appeared from the kitchen. And bring some of that cornbread if you've got it fresh. Always giving orders in my establishment, Martha grumbled, but her eyes were warm as she looked at Daniel. Her gaze shifted to Eleanor, taking in the red hair with obvious interest but no malice. You're the Boston girl. Heard what Hargrave did. Man's a fool. That seems to be the general consensus, Eleanor murmured. Martha laughed, a bark of sound that filled the room. Got spine, do you? Good. You'll need it out here. She disappeared back into the kitchen. So, Daniel said, leaning back in his chair, which creaked under his weight, what skills do you have besides correspondence and courage? Eleanor looked up sharply. Courage? Takes courage to leave everything behind and travel 2,000 miles to marry a stranger. Takes even more to stand there with your chin up while that stranger makes a fool of himself in public. She considered him, this blacksmith who'd appeared like something out of a frontier tale, all broad shoulders and easy strength. I can keep books. I managed my father's accounts before he died. I can cook, sew, teach children their letters and numbers. I can read Latin and some French, though I doubt that's much use out here. You'd be surprised, Daniel said. Doc Morrison would probably love someone who can read Latin. Half his medical books are still in it, and he's always complaining about not understanding the finer points. He paused as Martha returned with 2 plates laden with beef, potatoes, and thick slices of cornbread dripping with butter. Eleanor's stomach made an embarrassing sound, and Daniel chuckled. Eat, he said. We can talk more after you've got some food in you. The steak was tough but flavorful, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify. The cornbread was revelation, sweet and savory at once, nothing like the bread she'd known in Boston. She ate with more enthusiasm than was probably proper, but Daniel seemed pleased rather than scandalized. Tell me about your family, he said after a while, cutting his own steak with practiced efficiency. There's not much to tell anymore, Eleanor said quietly. My parents died last winter. Influenza took them both within days of each other. My father was a clerk in a shipping office, my mother a seamstress. We weren't wealthy, but we were, she searched for the word, comfortable, happy. I'm sorry for your loss. The simple statement, delivered without excessive sympathy or prying curiosity, made her throat tight. Thank you. After they died, I couldn't maintain the rent on our rooms. I had to sell everything, and even then, there wasn't enough to start over in Boston. When I saw Mr. Hargrave's advertisement for a bride, You thought it was a chance for a new beginning. Yes, she met his eyes. I suppose I was naive. Not naive, Daniel said firmly. Hopeful. There's a difference. He pushed the breadbasket toward her. Have another piece. Martha makes the best cornbread in 3 counties. How did you come to be in Willow Creek? Eleanor asked, accepting the bread gratefully. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, a shadow crossing his features. That's a longer story. The short version is, I needed a place where folks judge a man by his work, not his past. Willow Creek needed a blacksmith. I needed a fresh start. It worked out. Eleanor sensed depths beneath his simple explanation but didn't press. Everyone out here seemed to be running from something, or toward something, sometimes both at once. The blacksmith business must do well, she observed, noting his comfortable manner with spending money on a stranger's meal. Well enough, he agreed. Every horse needs shoes, every wagon needs repair, every farmer needs tools. I stay busy. He paused, studying her with those remarkable eyes. Busy enough that I could use help with the books, actually. I'm good with my hands, but terrible with figures. Been meaning to hire someone to keep the accounts straight. Eleanor's heart leaped, but she kept her voice steady. Is that so? It is. He leaned forward slightly. The pay wouldn't be much at first, maybe enough to cover your room and board here, plus a little extra. But it would be honest work, and it would give you time to figure out what you really want to do. Why? Eleanor asked bluntly. Why would you help me? You don't know me. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the checked tablecloth. My mother had red hair, he finally said, darkened to auburn as she aged, but when she was young, it was bright as yours. She faced the same stupidity, the same cruel whispers. She used to say that God gave red hair to the one strong enough to bear the weight of other folks' foolishness. Was she strong? Strongest woman I ever knew, raised 3 boys alone after my father died in a mining accident, kept us fed, clothed, and educated despite everything the world threw at her. His voice carried deep affection and old pain in equal measure. She passed 5 years ago, but I still hear her voice sometimes, especially when I see someone facing the kind of ignorance she battled every day. Eleanor blinked back unexpected tears. She sounds remarkable. She was. Daniel signaled Martha for coffee. So, what do you say? Want to try your hand at managing a blacksmith's books? Yes, Eleanor said without hesitation. Yes, I would like that very much. Good. He smiled, and it transformed his weather-beaten face into something almost boyish. Can you start tomorrow? I've got 6 months of receipts stuffed in a box that would probably make a proper bookkeeper weep. Tomorrow's perfect. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite hope yet, but the possibility of it. Martha brought the coffee, strong and black, with a small pitcher of cream that had probably come from the dairy at the edge of town. Eleanor added a generous amount, savoring the richness after weeks of trail coffee that had tasted like boiled dirt. I should warn you, Daniel said, his tone serious now. Hargrave won't like you working for me. He considers himself the social arbiter of Willow Creek, and he'll see your employment as a personal insult. Let him, Eleanor said with more bravado than she felt. He made his choice, publicly and cruelly. That's the spirit. Daniel raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. To new beginnings and the fools who make them necessary. Eleanor touched her cup to his, the clink of ceramic sealing something that felt like a pact. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting Willow Creek in shades of gold and amber. Through the dining room window, she could see people going about their evening routines, women calling children in for supper, men heading to the saloon for their nightly whiskey, horses being led to stables for the night. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd boarded the train in Boston. That life had included a respectable husband, a tidy house, perhaps children who would grow up to be part of Willow Creek's future prosperity. Instead, she found herself sitting across from a blacksmith with gentle eyes and work-worn hands, planning to spend her days sorting through receipts in what was probably a chaos of iron filings and coal dust. I should go, Daniel said eventually, though he made no immediate move to stand. Those horses really do need shoeing, and Tom Martinez gets cranky when his mount's not ready on time. Thank you, Eleanor said, putting all her gratitude into the simple words, for everything today. You'd have managed without me, Daniel said, finally rising. The chair scraped against the floor, and Eleanor realized just how large he was, not just tall, but broad, built for heavy work and hard living. But I'm glad I could help. I'll come by tomorrow morning, show you the way to the shop. I can find it, Eleanor said. You said it's at the end of town. Last building on the left, can't miss it. Big barn with smoke always coming from the chimney, and you'll hear the hammer from a block away. He paused at her chair. But I'll come anyway. Wouldn't want you facing the morning crowd alone, not after today. The protective note in his voice should have irritated her. She'd come west to be independent, after all. Instead, she found it oddly comforting. After months of being entirely alone in the world, someone was offering to stand beside her, even if just for a morning walk. Daniel left money on the table, enough for the meal and a generous tip for Martha, and headed for the door. He paused at the threshold, turning back to look at her. The dying sunlight caught him there, outlining his solid frame in gold, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some recognition she couldn't quite name. Miss McKenna, Eleanor, he said, Willow Creek might not be what you expected, but give it time. This place has a way of surprising people. Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone with her cooling coffee and racing thoughts. Martha bustled over to clear the plates, patting Eleanor's shoulder with unexpected kindness. That Daniel Ryder's a good man, she said quietly. Helped me patch my roof last winter, wouldn't take a cent for it. You could do worse than having him in your corner. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Through the window, she could see Daniel walking down the street, his long stride eating up the distance. A few people called out greetings, and he responded with waves or tips of his hat, clearly well-liked despite, or perhaps because of, his defense of the scandalous red-headed stranger. She finished her coffee slowly, letting the events of the day settle in her mind like sediment in still water. This morning she'd been a bride-to-be, nervous but hopeful, carrying her mother's cameo and her father's Bible toward what she'd believed would be a respectable future. Now she was a rejected woman, the subject of gossip and speculation, with a job keeping books for a blacksmith who'd shown her more kindness in an hour than her intended husband had shown in 23 letters. The irony wasn't lost on her. Wilfred Hargrave, with his precise handwriting and careful plans, had promised her security and position. Daniel Ryder, with his coal-dusted hands and easy smile, offered her work and dignity. She knew which one held more value. Eleanor made her way back to the lobby, where Mrs. Patterson was lighting the oil lamps against the gathering dusk. The older woman looked up from her task, her stern face unreadable. Room 7, she said, handing Eleanor a key. Top of the stairs, third door on the right. Chamber pots under the bed, water basins filled fresh each morning. Breakfast is at 6, dinner at 6. You miss the meal times, you don't eat. I understand, Eleanor said, taking the key. It was heavy iron, worn smooth by countless hands. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. Don't thank me yet, the woman said crisply. This is a respectable establishment. I don't tolerate drinking, carousing, or gentlemen callers after dark. You work for Daniel Ryder, that's your business, but you'll conduct yourself properly under my roof. Of course. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened almost imperceptibly. That being said, Mr. Ryder was right. You've got spine. That'll serve you well out here. She turned back to her lamps. Now get some rest. You look dead on your feet. Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The hallway was dim, lit only by a single lamp at the far end. She found room 7 and unlocked the door, stepping into what would be her home for at least the next week. The room was small but clean, with a narrow iron bed, a washstand with pitcher and basin, a small wardrobe, and a single chair by the window. Someone, Mrs. Patterson presumably, had already brought up her trunk. It sat at the foot of the bed, looking as out of place as Eleanor felt. She moved to the window and looked out at Willow Creek as shadows deepened across the valley. Lights were beginning to appear in windows, creating a constellation of human presence against the darkening land. Somewhere at the end of town, Daniel Ryder was probably still working, the ring of his hammer carrying on the evening air. Tomorrow, she would walk to his shop, begin sorting through 6 months of receipts, and start building something new from the ashes of her original plans. Eleanor unpinned her hair, that cursed, blessed red hair that had cost her one future but might have opened the door to another. It fell around her shoulders in waves, catching the last light from the window. She thought of Daniel's mother, facing down ignorance with strength and grace. She thought of Daniel himself, seeing beauty where others saw only strangeness. For the first time since Wilfred's rejection, Eleanor allowed herself to cry. Not tears of despair, but of release, of fear and relief and exhaustion, all mingled together. She cried for her parents, for the home she'd left behind, for the dreams that had shattered in the dusty street below. But she also cried for the unexpected kindness of strangers, for the possibility of tomorrow, for the strength she'd found in herself when everything fell apart. When the tears finally stopped, Eleanor felt empty but clean, like a slate wiped clear and ready for new writing. She washed her face in the basin, changed into her nightgown, and lay down on the unfamiliar bed. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the hotel settling for the night. Footsteps in the hall, muffled voices, the distant sound of piano music from the saloon down the street. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She would have to face the town's curiosity, Wilfred's certain displeasure, and the reality of work she'd never done before. But tonight, for just this moment, she was safe. She had a roof over her head, food in her stomach, and the promise of honest work from a man who looked at her red hair and saw sunrise instead of witchcraft. Eleanor pulled the thin blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw honey-colored eyes and broad shoulders, heard a deep voice saying her name like a promise. It wasn't the future she'd planned, but perhaps, just perhaps, it might be the one she was meant to have. The sound of a hammer striking iron drifted through her window, rhythmic as a heartbeat, and Eleanor fell asleep to its steady song, dreaming of fire and forge and the possibility of something stronger than mere survival. Morning came too soon, announced by Mrs. Patterson's sharp knock on every door along the hallway. Eleanor dressed carefully in her most practical dress, a brown wool that wouldn't show dirt easily, and pinned her hair into a severe bun that she hoped might minimize its impact. Looking in the small mirror above the washstand, she hardly recognized herself. Gone was the hopeful bride of yesterday, replaced by a woman with shadows under her eyes, but determination in the set of her jaw. The dining room was already half full when she arrived, conversation stopping mid-sentence as she entered. Eleanor kept her eyes forward, moving to an empty table in the corner. Martha appeared with coffee and a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits without being asked. "Daniel said to tell you he'll be here at 7, she said quietly. "Also said to eat hearty. It's a long day at the shop." Eleanor nodded her thanks and applied herself to breakfast, ignoring the whispers that rose and fell around her like tide. She caught fragments: Devil's Mark, Shameless, Poor Wilfred, but also Unexpected Defenders. Pretty enough. Hargrave's Loss. The Daniel knows what he's about. At precisely 7, Daniel's large frame filled the doorway. He'd cleaned up from yesterday, wearing a fresh shirt and pants, though Eleanor could see the permanent stain of coal dust ground into his hands. His presence had an immediate effect on the room. The hostile whispers died away, replaced by respectful nods and called greetings. "Miss McKenna," he said formally, but his eyes were warm. "Ready to tackle those accounts?" "As ready as one can be for 6 months of chaos," Eleanor replied, rising from her table. His laugh rumbled through the room. "That's the spirit. Though I should warn you, chaos might be generous. Disaster might be more accurate." They walked through Willow Creek's main street as the town woke fully around them. Shopkeepers were opening their doors, sweeping their stoops, setting out their wares. Daniel greeted each by name, introducing Eleanor simply as Miss McKenna, my new bookkeeper. No explanation, no justification, just a statement of fact that brooked no argument. The blacksmith shop was indeed at the very edge of town, a large barn-like structure with wide doors thrown open to the morning air. The smell hit Eleanor first, coal and hot metal, and something else, something elemental and old as the earth itself. Inside, the space was organized chaos. Tools hung on every wall, pieces of iron in various stages of transformation lay on benches, and in the center stood the forge itself, already glowing with banked coals. "Welcome to my domain," Daniel said with obvious pride. "It's not fancy, but it's honest work." "It's impressive," Eleanor said truthfully. The shop spoke of competence, of a man who knew his craft and took pride in it. The office is through here. Daniel led her to a small room at the back of the shop. Eleanor stopped in the doorway, momentarily stunned. Every surface was covered in papers, receipts, invoices, orders, correspondence, in no discernible order. A box in the corner overflowed with more papers, and she could see mouse droppings among the chaos. I did warn you, Daniel said sheepishly. Eleanor took a deep breath, rolled up her sleeves, and stepped into the disaster. I'll need a ledger, ink, pens, and probably a broom. Also some boxes to sort things into. I'll get them, Daniel said quickly, clearly relieved she hadn't run screaming. There's a storeroom next door with supplies. Help yourself to whatever you need. For the next hours, Eleanor lost herself in the familiar comfort of numbers and organization. She created a system. One pile for completed work, one for pending orders, one for supplies purchased, one for payments received. Slowly, patterns emerged from the chaos. Daniel was a better businessman than his record-keeping suggested, with steady customers and reasonable prices. But he was owed significant money by several prominent citizens, including, she noted with grim satisfaction, Wilfred Hargrave. $50 for wagon repair, 3 months overdue, she called out to Daniel, who was working at the forge. The hammer paused mid-strike. Hargrave always pays eventually. Usually. Usually isn't good enough, Eleanor said firmly. I'll prepare proper invoices with payment due dates. You can't run a business on usually. Daniel appeared in the doorway, sweat gleaming on his forehead despite the morning coolness. You sound like you know what you're talking about. My father dealt with shipping merchants for 20 years. Half of them would have cheerfully never paid a bill if someone didn't hold them accountable. She held up a receipt. This one's interesting. 1 dozen roses, iron for Mrs. Clearwater. You make flowers? Daniel's cheeks colored slightly above his beard. Sometimes. For special occasions. Mrs. Clearwater's daughter was getting married, wanted something that would last longer than real flowers. Eleanor tried to picture those large, work-hardened hands crafting delicate metal roses and found the image oddly moving. They must have been beautiful. They were all right, he said modestly. I can show you some time, if you'd like. I keep a few samples in the back. Before Eleanor could respond, a shadow fell across the doorway. Wilfred Hargrave stood there, his face purple with rage. How dare you, he said, his voice low and dangerous. How dare you humiliate me this way? Daniel straightened to his full height, the hammer still in his hand. Mr. Hargrave, come to pay your bill? My bill? Wilfred's voice rose to a near shriek. You have the audacity to discuss my bill while harboring this... Careful. Daniel's voice had gone very quiet, which was somehow more menacing than shouting would have been. Miss McKenna is my employee and under my protection. Choose your next words very carefully. Wilfred's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Finally, he managed, This is a deliberate insult. You knew she was my intended... Was, Daniel interrupted. Past tense. You rejected her, publicly and cruelly. That ended any claim you might have had to opinion about her choices. The whole town is talking. Let them talk. Daniel set down his hammer with deliberate calm. Miss McKenna is a respectable woman doing respectable work. If folks have nothing better to do than gossip, that's their problem, not hers. Eleanor stood and moved to stand beside Daniel, drawing strength from his solid presence. Mr. Hargrave, you owe this establishment $50 for wagon repair. I'll be sending a proper invoice this afternoon. Payment is due within 2 weeks. Wilfred's face went from purple to white. You can't. I can, and I will, Eleanor said calmly. Mr. Ryder has been generous in allowing extended payment terms, but that ends now. Every business deserves to be paid for services rendered. I'll ruin you, Wilfred hissed. Both of you. I'll make sure no respectable person in this town. Go ahead, Daniel said mildly. But remember, I shoe every horse in the valley, fix every wagon, mend every tool. You want to explain to folks why their horses are going lame because you're having a tantrum over a woman you didn't want anyway? The threat hung in the air like smoke from the forge. Wilfred stood frozen for a long moment, his fists clenched at his sides. Finally, he spun on his heel and stalked away, his back rigid with fury. Daniel and Eleanor stood in silence for a moment. Then Eleanor let out a shaky breath. "I might have just made things worse for you." "No," Daniel said firmly. "You did exactly right. Hargrave's been trading on intimidation for too long. About time someone stood up to him." He looked down at her, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "You're tougher than you look, Eleanor McKenna." "I had to be," she said simply. "And I suspect I'll have to be tougher still before this is over." Daniel nodded slowly. "Probably. But you won't be alone." He gestured toward the forge. "I should get back to work. Mrs. Martinez wants her kitchen knives sharpened by noon." Eleanor returned to the office, but her concentration was shot. She could feel the confrontation with Wilfred reverberating through her like the echo of Daniel's hammer strikes. She'd burned a bridge there, thoroughly and completely. There would be no going back, no chance of reconciliation even if she'd wanted it, which she emphatically did not. The morning wore on, punctuated by the rhythm of Daniel's work and the occasional customer. Eleanor watched through the office window as he interacted with the townspeople, patient with the elderly Mr. Jennings, who could never quite explain what was wrong with his plow, gentle with young Tommy Wright, who'd brought his mother's broken kettle, firm but fair with the cowboys who needed their horses shod quickly. This was a man who'd built respect through deed rather than word, who'd earned his place in Willow Creek through skill and reliability rather than money or social position. It was so different from the world she'd known in Boston, where status mattered more than substance, where her father had spent his life deferring to men who weren't half as capable as he was simply because they'd been born to better circumstances. Around noon, a woman appeared in the doorway, tall and elegant despite her simple calico dress, with dark hair streaked with premature silver. She carried a basket that smelled wonderfully of fresh bread and something savory. "Daniel Ryder," she called out in a voice that carried natural authority. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" Daniel looked up from the horseshoe he was shaping, his face breaking into a genuine smile. "Sarah Morrison, what brings the doctor's wife to my humble shop?" "Hunger, most likely," Sarah replied. Then her eyes found Eleanor in the office doorway. "You must be Miss McKenna. The whole town's talking about you." Eleanor's stomach clenched, but Sarah's smile was warm and welcoming. "Don't look so worried. Half of them are saying Wilfred Hargrave's a fool, and the other half have always said that anyway." She lifted the basket. "I brought lunch. James said Daniel probably forgot to arrange anything, and I figured you might appreciate not having to brave the hotel dining room again just yet." The simple kindness of it made Eleanor's eyes sting. "That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Morrison. Sarah, please. We don't stand much on ceremony here, despite what Wilfred Hargrave would like to believe." She began unpacking the basket onto a clean workbench. Thick sandwiches, pickled vegetables, a jar of what looked like lemonade, and half a pie that made Daniel groan with appreciation. "Sarah makes the best apple pie in the territory," he explained to Eleanor. "People have proposed marriage just to get the recipe." "Flatterer," Sarah said, but she looked pleased. "Though, speaking of marriage, that reminds me why I really came." She fixed Daniel with a stern look. "There's a barn dance Saturday night at the Clearwater place. You're going." "Sarah," Daniel started to protest. "No arguments. You haven't been to a social event in months. It's not healthy, all work and no play." She turned to Eleanor. "You should come too. Give folks a chance to see you're just a normal woman, not whatever nonsense Wilfred's been spreading." "I don't think that's a good idea," Eleanor said quickly. "My presence would only cause— Your presence would show that you're not hiding, not ashamed, and not afraid," Sarah interrupted gently. "Besides, I could use another sensible woman to talk to. These events are dominated by giggling girls and gossiping matrons. It would be nice to have someone who's actually read a book published this decade." Eleanor looked at Daniel, who shrugged. "Sarah usually gets her way. Might as well give in gracefully." "Then I suppose we're going to a barn dance," Eleanor said, trying not to think about how she had nothing appropriate to wear and no money to buy anything. Sarah seemed to read her mind, or perhaps her face. "Come by my house Friday afternoon. I have a dress that might work, and we're about the same size." Before Eleanor could protest about charity, Sarah added, "It's not charity, it's strategy. If you look good, it reflects well on those of us who support you. Pure selfishness, really." They ate lunch together in companionable conversation. Sarah was intelligent and well-read, having been educated back east before following her doctor husband to the frontier. She asked Eleanor about Boston, about books they'd both read, about news from the civilized world. It was the first normal conversation Eleanor had had in weeks, and she found herself relaxing despite everything. After Sarah left, the afternoon passed quickly. More customers came by, and Eleanor began to see the full scope of Daniel's business. He didn't just shoe horses and fix wagons. He was the town's problem solver, the one people came to when something was broken and they didn't know how to fix it. He mended everything from jewelry to firearms, created custom pieces that didn't exist in any catalog, and did it all with a patience and skill that spoke of true craftsmanship. "You're an artist," Eleanor said without thinking, watching him delicately repair a music box for the minister's wife. Daniel looked up, surprised. "It's just tinkering." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "My father knew men who called themselves artists who had half your skill. You see how things should fit together? How to make them better than they were. That's artistry." He ducked his head, clearly uncomfortable with the praise, but Eleanor saw the pleased flush on his cheeks. It occurred to her that perhaps no one had ever told him how remarkable his work was. In a town focused on survival and necessity, beauty and craft might be appreciated but rarely acknowledged aloud. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, Daniel banked the forge and began cleaning his tools. Eleanor had finished organizing the last of the receipts, creating a clear system for moving forward. The office, while still small and utilitarian, no longer looked like a disaster area. "You accomplished more in one day than I have in 6 months," Daniel said, surveying her work with obvious admiration. "Organization is just another kind of craft," Eleanor replied. "You see how metal should be shaped. I see how numbers should flow. We make a good team, then." The words hung in the air for a moment, weighted with more meaning than perhaps he'd intended. The walk back to the hotel felt different than the morning journey. People still stared, but Eleanor noticed subtle changes. A nod here, a slight smile there. Perhaps it was Daniel's presence beside her, or perhaps word had spread about her standing up to Wilfred Hargrave. Either way, the hostile edge had dulled slightly. "Same time tomorrow?" Daniel asked when they reached the hotel entrance. "I'll be there," Eleanor promised. "There's still the matter of collecting those overdue payments." "I've prepared invoices for everyone who owes you money." Daniel grimaced. "That'll make me popular." "Being popular and being paid aren't always the same thing," Eleanor said practically. "You can't keep working for free just to avoid awkwardness." "Spoken like a true Boston bookkeeper," Daniel said, but his tone was admiring rather than mocking. "Until tomorrow, then, Miss McKenna." Eleanor watched him walk away, his long stride eating up the distance back to his shop. She'd known him less than 2 days, yet already his presence felt essential, like a support beam in a house she was still building. The hotel dining room was quieter that evening. Eleanor ate quickly, avoiding eye contact with the other diners, then retreated to her room. She sat by the window, watching the town settle into evening routines, and allowed herself to think about the barn dance Sarah Morrison had mentioned. The thought of facing all those people, of dancing under their judgment, made her stomach clench with anxiety. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. Mrs. Patterson stood in the hallway, her usual stern expression softened slightly. "Thought you might want to know," the older woman said without preamble, "that Wilfred Hargrave was in the saloon tonight, trying to rally folks against you and Daniel both. Most weren't having it. Tom Martinez told him to pay his bills and shut his mouth, and that set the tone for the rest." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "That's unexpected." "Daniel Riders helped half this town at one point or another," Mrs. Patterson said. "Fixed things for free when folks couldn't pay, worked through the night when someone needed something urgent. People remember that." She paused. "Also, Hargrave's been getting too big for his britches lately. Some folks are enjoying seeing him taken down a peg." "I never intended to cause such division," Eleanor said quietly. "Division was already there," Mrs. Patterson replied. You just brought it to the surface. She turned to go, then paused. That dress you wore when you arrived, the navy one, that's your best? Eleanor flushed. It's my only good dress. The others are work clothes. Mrs. Patterson nodded as if she'd expected this. Come see me Friday morning. I might have something that would work for the dance. No sense giving folks more ammunition by showing up looking like a governess. Before Eleanor could respond, the older woman was gone, her footsteps receding down the hallway. Eleanor sat stunned by the unexpected kindness. She was learning that Willow Creek was more complex than it had first appeared, with undercurrents of loyalty and resentment, kindness and cruelty, all flowing beneath the surface of daily life. The next days fell into a rhythm. Eleanor would arrive at the blacksmith shop early, bringing coffee from the hotel kitchen. She and Daniel would share a few minutes of quiet conversation before the work began. Then she would disappear into the office while he worked the forge, the sound of his hammer providing a steady backdrop to her calculations. She sent out the invoices as promised, and to her surprise, most were paid promptly. Even Wilfred Hargrave sent his payment, though it was delivered by his clerk rather than in person. The money improved Daniel's financial situation considerably, and he insisted on giving Eleanor a bonus from the recovered funds. You earned it, he said when she protested. This is money I'd written off as lost. Thursday afternoon, while Eleanor was reconciling the week's accounts, she heard a commotion in the main shop, a woman's voice, high and distressed, followed by Daniel's deep rumble of reassurance. Eleanor peered out to see a young woman she didn't recognize, tears streaming down her face, holding what appeared to be pieces of a broken locket. It was my mother's, the woman was saying. She died last month, and it's all I have of her. My little boy grabbed it, and she held out the pieces helplessly. Daniel examined the locket with gentle fingers. The chain snapped and the hinges broken, but the locket itself is intact. I can fix this. I can't pay much, the woman said, fresh tears falling. My husband's been sick, hasn't been able to work. No charge, Daniel said immediately. Come back in an hour. It'll be good as new. The woman's gratitude was painful to witness. After she left, Eleanor emerged from the office. That was kind of you. Daniel shrugged, already heating small tools for the delicate work. Her husband's Jim Collins. Got kicked by a horse last month. Hasn't been right since. They're struggling. Eleanor watched him work on the tiny locket with the same focus he brought to horseshoes and wagon wheels. His large fingers moved with surprising delicacy, repairing the fragile hinge, soldering the chain links with minute precision. When he finished, the locket looked perfect, as if it had never been broken. You could have been a jeweler in a city, Eleanor observed. Made far more money than you do here. Daniel looked up at her, those honey eyes serious. Maybe. But cities have their own problems. Out here, when you help someone, you see the difference it makes. That matters more than money. When Mrs. Collins returned, her joy at seeing the repaired locket was luminous. She clutched it to her chest, thanking Daniel over and over. Eleanor saw him slip something into her hand as she left. Money, she realized. He'd not only fixed the locket for free, but given her something to help with their struggles. You can't save everyone, Eleanor said softly after Mrs. Collins had gone. No, Daniel agreed, but I can help the ones in front of me. That has to be enough. That evening, Eleanor found herself thinking about his words as she lay in her narrow hotel bed. In Boston, charity had been organized, distant, donations to churches or societies that helped the faceless poor. Here, poverty and kindness both had names and faces. The interconnections were visible, immediate. Daniel's kindness to the Collins family would ripple outward. They would remember, would help someone else when they could, would speak well of him to others. It was a different kind of economy, one that couldn't be captured in ledgers but was perhaps more valuable than gold. Friday morning, Eleanor presented herself at Mrs. Patterson's room as instructed. The older woman had laid out 3 dresses on her bed, all of good quality but slightly out of fashion. These were my daughters, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carefully neutral. She went back east 5 years ago. Married a banker in Chicago, said she couldn't stand the frontier anymore. The pain behind the words was carefully hidden, but still present. I couldn't, Eleanor began. You could and you will, Mrs. Patterson interrupted. They're doing no good in my wardrobe. Margaret's not coming back, and we both know it. Eleanor touched one of the dresses, a deep green silk with black trim that would complement her coloring perfectly. It's beautiful. Try it on, Mrs. Patterson ordered. Sarah Morrison's expecting you this afternoon for hair and final alterations if needed. The dress fit as if it had been made for her. The color made her skin glow and turned her red hair from a liability into an asset. Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. You'll do, she said simply. Show those fools what they're missing. That afternoon at Sarah Morrison's house was a revelation. The doctor's wife lived in one of Willow Creek's nicer homes, with real glass windows and a proper parlor. But more than the physical comfort, it was Sarah's easy acceptance that soothed Eleanor's nerves. I heard about the Collins locket, Sarah said as she pinned Eleanor's hair into an elaborate style. Daniel's always been like that. Did you know he practically rebuilt the Hendersons' barn after it burned down? Wouldn't take a cent, just said neighbors help neighbors. He seems to help everyone, Eleanor observed. Sarah's hand stilled for a moment. He does. Sometimes I think he's trying to make up for something, though I've never figured out what. He showed up here 7 years ago with nothing but his tools and enough skill to make folks overlook their questions. But there's sadness in him deep down. Haven't you noticed? Eleanor had noticed. Sometimes she caught Daniel staring at nothing, his face shadowed with old pain. But then someone would need his help, and he'd shake off whatever haunted him, returning to the present with determined focus. We all have our ghosts, Eleanor said carefully. True enough, Sarah agreed, resuming her work on Eleanor's hair. Lord knows this frontier is full of people running from something or toward something. The trick is figuring out what you're doing and making peace with it. Saturday arrived with unseasonable heat that had everyone fanning themselves and predicting storms. Eleanor spent the morning helping Daniel with emergency repairs. The heat had warped several wagon wheels, and ranchers needed them fixed immediately. She found herself holding tools, fetching water, even working the bellows when Daniel needed both hands free. They developed a wordless rhythm, anticipating each other's needs with increasing accuracy. You're turning into a decent apprentice, Daniel said, wiping sweat from his brow as the last rancher departed with his repaired wagon. I'll stick to bookkeeping, thanks, Eleanor replied, though she was secretly pleased. I don't have the arms for forge work. Daniel's gaze flickered to her arms, then away quickly. You're stronger than you think. The moment hung between them, charged with something Eleanor didn't quite dare name. Then Daniel cleared his throat and began banking the forge. We should get ready for tonight. The Clearwater place is a few miles out, and I need to arrange a wagon. I can ride, Eleanor said, then realized she'd assumed they would go together. That is, if you were planning, I was planning on escorting you, yes, Daniel said, a slight smile playing at his lips. Wouldn't be proper otherwise. Can you actually ride, or were you being optimistic? I can ride, Eleanor said with dignity. My father kept a horse when I was younger, before the financial troubles started. Good. Horseback's better than a wagon anyway, more flexible. Eleanor understood what he wasn't saying. If things went badly, if the crowd turned hostile, they could leave quickly on horseback. The thoughtfulness of it, the protective planning, made her chest tight with emotion. That evening, Eleanor stood before the mirror in her room, hardly recognizing herself. The green dress brought out colors in her skin she'd never noticed. Sarah's styling had turned her unruly hair into something elegant yet soft. She looked like a woman who belonged at a frontier dance, not the rejected mail-order bride who'd stood in the street 5 days ago. Daniel was waiting outside the hotel with 2 horses, his own large black gelding and a smaller bay mare with gentle eyes. He was wearing his best clothes, which Eleanor realized with a pang were still work clothes, just cleaner and less mended. But somehow the simple black pants and white shirt suited him better than any fancy suit would have. He looked solid, real, dependable. When he saw her, his expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for her to read them all. Wonder was there, certainly, and something else that made her pulse quicken. You look, he started, then stopped, apparently at a loss for words. Like I might not embarrass you? Eleanor suggested lightly, though her heart was racing. Like you might cause a riot, Daniel said frankly. Every unmarried man in the valley is going to want to dance with you. I only care about one, Eleanor said, then immediately wished she could take the words back. It was too much, too revealing. But Daniel just smiled, slow and warm. Good to know. He helped her mount the mare, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. Then they were riding through the cooling evening toward the Clearwater Ranch, the sun painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. The Clearwater barn was already lit up when they arrived, lanterns hanging from every beam, music spilling out into the night. Wagons and horses filled the yard, and Eleanor could see people milling about, dressed in their finest clothes. Her courage almost failed her then, but Daniel was already dismounting, reaching up to help her down. Remember, he said quietly, half these people are on your side. The other half don't matter. They entered the barn together, and conversation stuttered to a halt. Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of eyes, heard the whispers start immediately. But then Sarah Morrison was there, sweeping them into her social circle with the authority of a doctor's wife and the determination of a friend. Eleanor, you remember my husband James, and this is Mary Clearwater, our hostess, and her daughter Beth, the one Daniel made those iron roses for. The introductions blurred together, but Eleanor noticed something important. Not everyone was hostile. Many of the women seemed curious rather than condemning, and several of the men were eyeing her with obvious appreciation. Wilfred Hargrave was there, holding court near the refreshment table, but his audience seemed smaller than usual. The music started up again, a lively reel that had couples flooding the dance floor. Eleanor found herself watching, remembering the last time she danced at a church social in Boston, her father still alive, her future still uncertain, but hopeful. Would you dance with me? Daniel's voice was soft at her ear. Eleanor turned to find him offering his hand, his expression serious but warm. I'd be honored. He led her onto the floor, and Eleanor discovered that Daniel Ryder, blacksmith and craftsman, could dance. Not the polished steps of a Boston ballroom, but something better. A natural grace and rhythm that came from bodily awareness, from years of controlling strength and movement in his work. They moved together through the patterns of the dance, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. This felt right in a way that nothing with Wilfred ever had. Daniel's hand at her waist was steady, supportive without being possessive. When the dance required them to separate and come back together, his eyes never left hers, as if she were the only person in the crowded barn. Where did you learn to dance? She asked, as they came together in a turn. My mother insisted, he said, spinning her gently. Said a man who couldn't dance was only half civilized. She was a wise woman. She would have liked you, Daniel said, and there was something in his voice that made Eleanor's breath catch. The dance ended, but before Daniel could escort her off the floor, another man appeared, younger, cleaner, with the soft look of someone who'd never done hard labor. Might I have the next dance, Miss McKenna? He didn't wait for an answer, practically pulling her away from Daniel. The young man, Robert something, she didn't catch his last name, was a terrible dancer but an enthusiastic talker. He peppered her with questions about Boston, about culture, about anything that would let him show off his own limited education. Eleanor answered politely, but found her eyes searching for Daniel. She spotted him by the wall, arms crossed, looking thunderous. The dance couldn't end soon enough. The moment it did, Eleanor excused herself and made her way back to Daniel. You looked ready to commit murder, she said quietly. Robert Pinkerton, Daniel said flatly. His father owns the biggest ranch in the valley. He's been shopping for a wife for 2 years, but no local girl will have him. Why not? Because he's a pompous ass who thinks money makes up for personality, Sarah Morrison said, appearing at Eleanor's elbow. Also, he's been sniffing around you since he heard about Wilfred's rejection. Sees an opportunity. Eleanor shuddered slightly. He reminds me of Wilfred, actually. All surface, no substance. Exactly, Daniel said, relaxing slightly. Though, if you wanted, I don't, Eleanor said firmly. I've had enough of men who see me as an acquisition rather than a person. Daniel's expression softened. Dance with me again? This time it was a waltz, slower, more intimate. Daniel held her closer than strict propriety might dictate, but Eleanor didn't protest. She could feel the strength in his arms, smell the soap he'd used mixed with something essentially him, leather and iron and honest work. "People are staring," she murmured. "Let them," Daniel replied. "They'd stare anyway. Might as well give them something worth looking at." Eleanor laughed, surprising herself. "You're not what I expected when I came west." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Romance, perhaps. Adventure. A neat, orderly life with a respectable merchant." She looked up at him. "Instead, I got rejection, gossip, and a blacksmith who makes iron roses and fixes lockets for free." "Disappointed?" There was vulnerability in the question despite his light tone. "No," Eleanor said softly. "Surprised, in the best possible way." They danced 3 more dances together, causing enough comment that Eleanor could hear the whispers growing louder. But she found she didn't care. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, she felt like herself. Not the rejected bride, not the scandalous woman with red hair, just Eleanor, dancing with a man who looked at her like she was precious. The spell was broken when Wilfred Hargrave approached during a break in the music. He'd clearly been drinking, his face flushed and his steps slightly unsteady. "Well, well," he said loudly enough for half the barn to hear, "the witch and the blacksmith." How appropriate. Both covered in soot and sin. Daniel stepped forward, but Eleanor caught his arm. "Don't. He's not worth it." "Listen to your woman, Ryder," Wilfred sneered. "Though woman might be generous. We all know what kind of female throws herself at the first man to show interest after being righteously rejected." The barn had gone silent. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, an unexpected voice rang out. "That's enough, Hargrave." Tom Martinez stepped forward. He was a small man, weathered by years of ranching, but he commanded respect through sheer force of character. "You're drunk and you're being disrespectful to a lady." "Lady?" Wilfred laughed unpleasantly. "She's no lady. She's a Choose your next word very carefully," Daniel said, his voice deadly quiet. "Because if you insult Miss McKenna again, I'll forget that violence doesn't solve problems." "You'll what?" Wilfred puffed up like a bantam rooster. "You think you can threaten me?" "I could buy and sell you 10 times over." "Maybe," Daniel said calmly, "but you can't buy respect and you can't buy fear from someone who doesn't give a damn about your money." The tension in the barn was thick enough to cut. Eleanor saw hands moving toward weapons, not drawn, but ready. This was about to turn into something ugly. "Mr. Hargrave," Eleanor said, stepping forward with all the dignity she could muster, "you're right about one thing. I did throw myself at the first man to show interest after you rejected me. But not in the way you're implying." She raised her voice so everyone could hear. "Daniel Ryder showed me kindness when you showed me cruelty. He offered me honest work when you left me stranded. He treated me with respect when you treated me like damaged goods." She took a breath, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she had. "You rejected me because of superstition and prejudice, because the color of my hair didn't match your narrow idea of respectability. That was your choice, and I've accepted it. But what I won't accept is you trying to poison others against me because your pride is wounded." "My pride?" Wilfred's voice rose to near hysteria. "You've humiliated me." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "You humiliated yourself. You had the chance to marry a woman who would have been a faithful wife, a good partner in your business, a respectable member of this community. You threw that away because of the color of my hair. Any humiliation you feel is entirely self-inflicted." "Here, here," someone called out, and Eleanor was surprised to see it was Mrs. Patterson, dressed in her finest black silk. Other voices joined in, supporting Eleanor. Not everyone. She could see plenty of faces that still held condemnation, but enough. Enough to show that Willow Creek wasn't united behind Wilfred Hargrave. Wilfred looked around wildly, realizing he'd lost control of the situation. "This isn't over," he hissed, then stumbled toward the door. "Actually it is," Tom Martinez said conversationally. "Hargrave, you're no longer welcome at Clearwater Event. A man who can't hold his liquor and his tongue doesn't belong in polite company." Wilfred's face went purple, but faced with Tom Martinez's authority and the murmur of agreement from the crowd, he had no choice but to leave. The doors swung shut behind him with a final sound. The silence held for a moment more, then Mary Clearwater, bless her, called out, "Well, I think we've had enough drama. Musicians, play something lively. This is supposed to be a celebration." The music started up again, and gradually the crowd returned to dancing. But something had shifted. Eleanor found herself surrounded by people wanting to talk to her, to express support, or at least curiosity. Women complimented her dress. Men asked about Boston, and through it all, Daniel stayed close, a solid, reassuring presence at her side. "That was brave," he said during a quiet moment, standing up to him like that. "I was terrified," Eleanor admitted, "but also angry. He had no right to try to ruin this for us." "Us?" Daniel's eyes were warm on hers. Eleanor flushed, but didn't look away. "Us, whatever that means." "I know what I'd like it to mean," Daniel said quietly. "But you've been through enough upheaval. I won't add to it by pushing for something you're not ready for." Eleanor's heart was racing. "What if I am ready?" Daniel's hand found hers, his calloused fingers gentle. "Then we take it slow. Do things proper. Court like we should have from the beginning, if the world had been different." "I'd like that," Eleanor whispered. They danced one more dance as the evening wound down, this one slow and sweet. Eleanor rested her head against Daniel's chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her cheek. Around them, couples swayed to the music, and for a moment she felt part of something larger. Not an outsider or a scandal, but a member of this community, rough and imperfect as it was. The ride back to town was quiet, the horses walking slowly through the cooling night. The moon had risen full and bright, painting the landscape in silver and shadow. Eleanor felt loose-limbed and content in a way she hadn't since before her parents died. "Thank you," she said as they neared the hotel, "for standing up for me. For the job. For everything." "You don't need to thank me," Daniel said. "You've more than earned your place here. The books have never been in better shape, and—" He paused, seeming to gather courage. "You've made my days brighter just by being there." Eleanor's throat tight with emotion. "You saved me, you know. When Wilfred rejected me, I thought my life was over. But you gave me a chance to build something new, something better." Daniel dismounted and helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something. About why I came to Willow Creek. Why I understand about starting over." Eleanor waited, sensing this was important. "I was married before," Daniel said quietly. "Back in Kansas. Her name was Margaret, and she was everything I thought I wanted, delicate, refined, proper. We married young, had a little farm outside Lawrence." His voice grew rough. "There was a drought, then sickness. Cholera took her and our baby girl. They died within hours of each other." Eleanor's hand found his arm, squeezing gently. "I couldn't stay," Daniel continued. "Everything reminded me of them. So I sold the farm, packed my tools, and headed west. I've been running ever since, trying to work hard enough that I don't have to think, don't have to remember." He looked at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Until you stepped off that stagecoach with your red hair blazing in the sun. And for the first time in 7 years, I wanted to stop running." Eleanor reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his cheek against her palm. "We're all running from something, or toward something, maybe both." "What are you running toward?" Daniel asked softly. "I thought I knew," Eleanor said. "I thought I was running toward security, respectability, a safe life with a safe man. But now—" She took a breath. "Now I think I was running toward you. I just took the long way around." Daniel made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, then pulled her against him, holding her tight. Eleanor wrapped her arms around his broad back, feeling the solid warmth of him, the safety of his embrace. They stood there in the moonlight, two damaged souls finding healing in each other. "I want to court you proper," Daniel said against her hair. "Dinners and walks and all of it. You deserve that." "All right," Eleanor agreed. "But Daniel?" I already know how this story ends. He pulled back to look at her. You do? Yes, Eleanor said with certainty she felt in her bones. It ends with us, together, building something good and strong and real. Daniel's smile was like sunrise. I like that ending. He walked her to the hotel door, then surprised her by lifting her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Good night, Eleanor McKenna. Thank you for the best evening I've had in 7 years. Eleanor floated up to her room, her lips curved in a smile that wouldn't fade. Through her window, she could see Daniel walking back to the livery stable with the horses, his whistling carrying on the night air. It was a cheerful tune, something she didn't recognize, but it sounded like hope. She sat at her small desk and took out paper and pen. There was someone who needed to know about this turn of events. Dear Cousin Mary, she wrote, you will never believe what has happened since I wrote last. I came to Wyoming to marry a merchant and instead found myself rejected for my red hair. But Mary, that rejection was the greatest gift because it led me to someone extraordinary. She wrote long into the night, telling Mary about Daniel, about the shop, about the dance, and Wilfred's continued hostility and the unexpected kindness of strangers. She wrote about iron roses and repaired lockets, about strong hands that could be endlessly gentle, about honey-colored eyes that saw her truly. As she sealed the letter, Eleanor realized she hadn't thought about Boston in days. That life, the grieving daughter, the desperate woman who'd answered a mail-order bride advertisement, felt like someone else's story now. She was becoming someone new out here in the wilderness, shaped by challenge and kindness in equal measure. Sunday dawned bright and clear. Eleanor dressed carefully in her brown work dress, pinning her hair back severely. She would not give the gossips anything to talk about by appearing too fine or too confident. But when she looked in the mirror, she saw that something had changed in her face. There was a glow there, a happiness that couldn't be hidden. Daniel was waiting outside the hotel when she emerged for church. He was wearing his good clothes again, his hair still damp from washing. He offered her his arm formally, properly, and they walked to the small white church at the center of town. Their entrance caused the expected stir, but Eleanor noticed more smiles than frowns. Sarah Morrison waved them over to sit with her family, and suddenly they were not a scandal, but simply another courting couple, taking their place in the community's fabric. Reverend Phillips, ancient and wise, gave a sermon about judgment and redemption that seemed pointed enough to make several people squirm, though Wilfred Hargrave was noticeably absent. Eleanor tried to focus on the words, but she was achingly aware of Daniel beside her, his solid presence like an anchor in uncertain seas. After church, there was the usual social gathering in the yard. Eleanor braced herself for snubs or confrontation, but instead found herself drawn into conversation with several of the town's matrons. They asked about her bookkeeping skills, about Boston, about her plans. When she mentioned she was working for Daniel, there were knowing looks but no condemnation. He's a good man, Mrs. Martinez said firmly. Been waiting for the right woman to see it. Some of us thought it might be the widow Harrison, another woman added with a sly smile, but she's got her eye on the new banker from Denver. They gossiped gently about other matches and mismatches, and Eleanor realized she was being accepted, brought into the fold of women who really ran the town through their networks of information and influence. It was conditional acceptance. She would need to continue proving herself. But it was a start. Daniel found her as the gathering was breaking up. Survived the interrogation? Barely, Eleanor said with a laugh. I think I've been provisionally approved, pending good behavior. That's all anyone gets out here, Daniel said. We're all on probation until we prove ourselves. He paused, then added, Would you like to take a walk? The weather's fine, and I could show you the creek the town's named for. They walked out past the last buildings, following a worn path through prairie grass that whispered in the breeze. The creek, when they reached it, was a modest affair, barely 10 feet wide, running clear and cold from the mountains. Not much to name a town after, Daniel said apologetically. It's perfect, Eleanor said, enchanted by the willows that drooped over the water, creating pools of green shade. It's an oasis. They sat on a large flat rock that had clearly served this purpose for many couples over the years. Eleanor could see initials carved into a nearby tree trunk, testament to other romances that had bloomed in this spot. "I've been thinking," Daniel said, his voice careful, "about what you said last night. About knowing how the story ends." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "And I want you to be sure," he said, turning to look at her directly. "Not grateful, not settling because options are limited, but sure. You came here for one life and got thrown into another. That's a lot to adjust to." Eleanor considered his words, understanding the fear behind them. He'd lost one wife already, had his life shattered once before. He needed to know this was real. "I was sure the moment you made Wilfred pay his bill," she said, making him laugh. "But truly, Daniel, I know my own mind. Yes, this isn't what I planned. But maybe that's why it's right. All my plans, all my careful preparations, they were based on fear. Fear of poverty, of being alone, of having no place in the world. This," she gestured between them, "this is based on something better, on respect and friendship and, Daniel prompted softly. "And love," Eleanor said, meeting his eyes, "or at least the beginning of it. The seed that could grow into something strong and lasting if we tend it carefully." Daniel's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing naturally. "I haven't felt this way in 7 years. Haven't wanted to feel this way. It scared me, how quickly you got under my defenses." "You got under mine too," Eleanor admitted. "I came here with my heart locked up tight, determined to make a practical marriage with no messy emotions. Then you lifted my trunk and called my hair beautiful and ruined all my careful plans." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the water flow. Eleanor felt peace settle over her like a blanket. This was right. Despite all the chaos and uncertainty, despite Wilfred's hostility and the town's gossip, this moment, this man, this future, it was right. "There's something else," Daniel said eventually. "Something I should tell you about the shop. I've been thinking about expanding. There's enough business to support it, especially now that you're getting everyone to pay their bills on time. I could take on an apprentice, maybe add a proper storefront for selling tools and hardware. But it would mean changes, risks." "What kind of risks?" Eleanor asked, intrigued by the vision of growth he was painting. "Financial mostly. I'd need to take a loan from the bank, and if it didn't work out," he shrugged, "but with someone good at books keeping track of everything, making sure we stay profitable." "You mean with me?" Eleanor said, understanding. He wasn't just talking about business expansion, he was talking about a future that included her, integral to his plans. "I mean with you," Daniel confirmed, "as a business partner, and more, if you're willing." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "I'm willing. Though I should point out that having a woman as a business partner will cause even more gossip." "Let them gossip," Daniel said firmly. "We'll be too successful to care." They walked back as the sun began to sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. At the hotel entrance, Daniel paused. "Tomorrow's Monday. Back to work. But Tuesday evening, would you have dinner with me? Proper courting dinner, just the two of us?" "I'd like that," Eleanor said, feeling ridiculously pleased by the formal invitation. Monday morning came with unexpected rain, a steady drizzle that turned the streets to mud and sent everyone scurrying for cover. Eleanor arrived at the shop soaked despite her best efforts with an umbrella. Daniel had already built up the fire in the forge, and the heat was welcome. "There's coffee," he said, gesturing to a pot warming near the forge. "And Mrs. Martinez sent over some pastries. Said you're too thin and need feeding up." Eleanor laughed, helping herself to both coffee and a sweet roll that tasted of cinnamon and brown sugar. "The mothering instincts of this town are fearsome." "They are," Daniel agreed, "but useful. I haven't had to cook for myself in years." They fell into their routine, Eleanor in the office and Daniel at the forge, but there was a new awareness between them. When Daniel brought her receipts from a customer, their fingers brushed and both lingered. When Eleanor emerged to ask a question about pricing, she found herself standing closer than necessary, breathing in his scent of iron and honest work. The rain brought unexpected business. Farmers came in with tools that had rusted, wagon wheels that had swollen and cracked, all manner of repairs that had been put off but now seemed urgent with the weather turning. Daniel worked steadily, and Eleanor kept track of each transaction, noting patterns, identifying opportunities. "You know," she said during a brief lull, "you could offer a subscription service. For a monthly fee, farmers get priority repairs and a discount on parts. It would give you steady income even in slow months." Daniel looked up from the horseshoe he was shaping. "That's brilliant. Would they go for it?" "Present it right, and they will. Security in exchange for loyalty. It's good business for everyone." He grinned at her. "Beautiful and smart." How did I get so lucky? Before Eleanor could respond, the shop door banged open. A man she didn't recognize stood there, water streaming from his coat, his face grim. "You Daniel Ryder?" he asked brusquely. "I am," Daniel said, setting down his hammer. "How can I help you?" The man pulled out a badge. "Federal Marshal James Crawford. I need to ask you some questions about your whereabouts 7 years ago. Specifically about the death of Marcus Webb in Kansas." Eleanor felt the blood drain from Daniel's face. His hands, always so steady, began to tremble. "I don't know what you're talking about," Daniel said, but his voice was hollow. "I think you do," the marshal said. "You're Daniel Ryder, formerly of Lawrence, Kansas. Your wife and daughter died of cholera in '68, and 2 days after their funeral, Marcus Webb was found dead in his barn, beaten to death with what looked like a blacksmith's hammer. Eleanor's hand flew to her throat as the marshal's words hung in the air like smoke from the forge. The rain drummed steadily on the roof, but inside the shop, the silence was deafening. She watched Daniel's face transform from shock to something harder, older, an expression she'd never seen before. "Marcus Webb," Daniel repeated slowly, as if tasting the name after years of trying to forget it. "I haven't heard that name in 7 years." "But you knew him," Marshal Crawford pressed, water still dripping from his coat onto the packed earth floor. "I knew him," Daniel confirmed, his voice flat. "He owned the land next to mine. He was also the man who sold me the contaminated well water that killed my wife and daughter." Eleanor gasped softly. The marshal's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance, a slight softening of his aggressive posture. "That was never proven," Crawford said carefully. "No," Daniel agreed bitterly. "It wasn't. Webb had money, connections. The sheriff was his cousin. The judge owed him favors. When I tried to bring charges, they laughed me out of the courthouse, said cholera was an act of God, not murder." "So you took justice into your own hands?" the marshal asked. Daniel's jaw clenched. "I went to his barn that night, yes. I wanted to confront him, to make him admit what he'd done. He'd been bragging in the saloon about how he'd finally gotten my land cheap once I sold it to pay for the funerals." His hands formed fists at his sides. "But when I got there, he was already dead." "Convenient," Crawford said skeptically. "The truth often isn't," Daniel shot back. "I found him lying in his own blood, skull caved in, and I knew exactly what everyone would think. The grieving husband, the man who'd threatened Webb publicly, finding the body. I didn't stay to explain. I gathered my tools and left Kansas that same night." Eleanor moved without thinking, stepping to Daniel's side. "He's telling the truth," she said firmly, though she had no proof beyond the certainty in her heart. Crawford's eyes shifted to her. "And you are?" "Eleanor McKenna," she said, lifting her chin. "Mr. Ryder's bookkeeper and intended." She felt Daniel's surprise at the word, but he didn't contradict her. Instead, his hand found hers, gripping tight. "Miss McKenna," the marshal said patiently, "I appreciate your loyalty, but you've known Mr. Ryder for what, a week? 2? "Long enough to know he's not a murderer," Eleanor said steadily. "Long enough to see him repair things for people who can't pay, to watch him help anyone who needs it, to understand that he's spent 7 years trying to atone for something that wasn't even his crime." Crawford studied them both for a long moment, rain pattering steadily in the background. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a worn piece of paper. "This came to the federal office last month," he said, unfolding it. "Deathbed confession from a man named Carl Hendricks. Says he killed Marcus Webb in a dispute over cattle prices. Says he's been living with the guilt ever since, especially knowing another man was blamed for it." Daniel's legs seemed to give out. He sat heavily on a workbench, his face in his hands. Eleanor could see his shoulders shaking, though whether from relief or delayed grief she couldn't tell. "Why didn't you lead with that?" Eleanor demanded, anger flaring at the marshal's cruel game. "Because I needed to see his reaction," Crawford said calmly. "Needed to be sure. A written confession from a dead man isn't worth much if the living man's reaction doesn't ring true." He folded the paper and put it away. "Mr. Ryder, you're officially cleared of any wrongdoing in Marcus Webb's death. I'll wire the authorities in Kansas today." Daniel looked up, his eyes wet. 7 years, he said hoarsely. 7 years of running, of looking over my shoulder, of being afraid someone would come for me. "Well, someone did come," Crawford said with a slight smile. "Just not the way you expected." He tipped his hat. "I'll be in town for a few days, tidying up the paperwork. Try not to leave suddenly. It would complicate things." After the marshal left, Eleanor and Daniel stood frozen for a moment. Then Eleanor was in his arms, holding him as he shook with the release of 7 years of fear and guilt. She could feel his tears against her neck, hot and necessary, washing away the last barriers between who he'd been and who he could become. "I should have told you," he said against her hair, "about Webb, about why I really left Kansas." "You told me what mattered," Eleanor said, pulling back to look at him. "You told me about losing your family. The rest was just noise." Daniel cupped her face in his large hands, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "You called yourself my intended." "I did," Eleanor said, heat rising in her cheeks but not looking away. "Was I wrong?" "No," Daniel said fervently. "God, no." "Eleanor, He stopped, seeming to gather courage. "I love you. I know it's too soon, too fast, but I loved you the moment you stood up to Hargrave in the street. I loved you when you organized my disaster of an office. I loved you when you danced with me despite the whole town watching. I love your courage and your kindness, and yes, God help me, I love your red hair that catches fire in the sunlight." Eleanor laughed through her tears. "I love you too, you impossible man. I love your gentle hands and your stubborn integrity, and the way you see beauty in broken things and make them whole again." He kissed her then, there in his shop with the rain falling and the forge cooling and the whole world shifting into new possibilities. It was a kiss that tasted of tears and rain and hope, a kiss that sealed promises and opened doors and changed everything. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor saw that the rain had stopped. Sunlight was breaking through the clouds, sending rays of gold through the shop windows. "We should probably tell people," Daniel said, his voice rough. "Make it official." "After what just happened with the marshal, the whole town probably knows already," Eleanor said wryly. "News travels fast in Willow Creek." As if to prove her point, the shop door burst open and Sarah Morrison rushed in, followed closely by Mrs. Patterson and, surprisingly, Tom Martinez. "Is it true?" Sarah demanded. "Marshal Crawford cleared you of the Kansas matter?" "How did you—" Daniel began. "The marshal stopped at the hotel for a drink," Mrs. Patterson said crisply. "Mentioned he'd cleared up an old case. Hotel walls are thin, and voices carry." Tom Martinez stepped forward, his weathered face serious. "Daniel, I've got to ask. This Webb fellow, the one who died, did you—" "No," Daniel said firmly. "I wanted to hurt him. God knows I did. He as good as murdered my family, but I didn't kill him." Tom nodded slowly. "Good enough for me. Man's past is his own business anyway. It's what he does in the present that matters." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though this does explain why you've been working yourself to death these 7 years. Guilt's a heavy burden, even when it's misplaced." "Speaking of the present," Sarah said, her eyes bright with curiosity as she looked between Daniel and Eleanor, "I couldn't help but notice Miss McKenna referred to herself as your intended." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could speak, Daniel's arm came around her waist, pulling her against his side. "She did," he said simply, "and she was right. I've asked Eleanor to marry me, and she's agreed." That wasn't exactly how it had happened, but Eleanor wasn't about to quibble. "We were planning to court properly first," she added. "Take our time, do things right." "Court properly?" Mrs. Patterson snorted. Girl, you've been living in my hotel for a week with the whole town watching your every move. You've weathered a public rejection, stood up to Wilfred Hargrave twice, and now you're standing by a man who just got cleared of a murder charge. I'd say you've been courted plenty. Martha's right, Tom said. Out here, we don't have time for long courtships. When you know, you know. And from what I've seen, you two know. Sarah was practically bouncing with excitement. Oh, this is wonderful. A wedding, a proper wedding to wash away all the ugliness of the past week. When were you thinking? Spring? Christmas? We hadn't, Eleanor began. Next month, Daniel said suddenly. When everyone looked at him in surprise, he squared his shoulders. I've waited 7 years to stop running, to stop being afraid. I don't want to wait anymore. Unless, he looked down at Eleanor, uncertainty creeping into his voice, unless you want more time? Eleanor thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Next month sounds perfect. The shop erupted in congratulations and planning. Sarah immediately began discussing flowers and food. Mrs. Patterson offered the hotel dining room for the reception, and Tom promised to spread the word to the ranchers and farmers. In the midst of the chaos, Eleanor felt Daniel's hand find hers, anchoring her to what really mattered. You sure about this? He asked quietly, while the others debated cake flavors. I've never been more sure of anything, Eleanor replied. You? Same. He squeezed her hand. Though we should probably deal with Wilfred. He's not going to take this well. As if summoned by his name, Wilfred Hargrave appeared in the shop doorway, his face mottled with rage. The happy chatter died instantly. So it's true, he said, his voice shaking. You're actually going to marry her. The witch and the murderer. Watch yourself, Hargrave, Tom Martinez warned. But Wilfred was beyond caution. I heard what the marshal said. Cleared of charges. But we all know the truth, don't we? A man doesn't run for 7 years if he's innocent. Actually, Marshal Crawford's voice came from behind Wilfred, making the merchant jump. That's exactly what an innocent man does when he knows the deck is stacked against him. Smart move on Ryder's part, getting out of Kansas when he did. Webb's cousin was sheriff then, would have railroaded him for sure. Wilfred spun to face the marshal. You're defending him? I'm stating facts, Crawford said calmly. Daniel Ryder is innocent of any crime. That's official. Anyone spreading rumors to the contrary will be dealing with federal law enforcement. That includes you, Mr. Hargrave. This is intolerable, Wilfred sputtered. The whole town's gone mad. That woman, he pointed at Eleanor, has bewitched you all with her red hair and her Eastern ways. Oh, for heaven's sake, Mrs. Patterson said disgustedly. Wilfred, you're making a fool of yourself. More of a fool, I should say. The only person bewitched here is you, and it's by your own pride and prejudice. I'll ruin you all, Wilfred threatened wildly. I'll call in every debt, refuse credit at my store, make sure— You'll do nothing of the sort, a new voice interrupted. Eleanor turned to see a distinguished older man she didn't recognize, dressed in an expensive suit that marked him as someone important. Mr. Thornton, Wilfred said, his face going pale. Banker Thornton to you, Hargrave, the man said coldly. I've been watching your behavior this past week with increasing disgust. Bad enough you publicly humiliated a young woman for the color of her hair. But these continued attacks, this vindictive persecution, it's bad for business. Bad for business? Wilfred echoed weakly. Very bad, Thornton confirmed. You owe my bank considerable money, Hargrave. Loans for your store expansion, credit for inventory. I'm calling those loans in. You have 30 days to pay in full, or I'll seize your assets. The shop went completely silent. Even Sarah had stopped talking, her mouth open in shock. You can't, Wilfred whispered. That's everything I own. I can and I will, Thornton said firmly. Unless. Wilfred grabbed at the word like a lifeline. Unless you publicly apologize to Miss McKenna and Mr. Ryder. In church, this Sunday, in front of the entire congregation, and then you leave them alone. Completely. No more rumors, no more threats, no more of this nonsense. Wilfred's face cycled through several colors before settling on a sickly gray. This is blackmail. This is business, Thornton corrected. Bad character is bad for business. Choose, Hargrave, your pride or your store. For a moment, Eleanor thought Wilfred might actually choose pride. His whole body shook with rage, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. Then, like a balloon deflating, all the fight went out of him. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. Sunday. I'll apologize. Publicly and sincerely, Thornton emphasized. Yes, Wilfred ground out, then fled the shop as if pursued by demons. Thornton turned to Eleanor and Daniel with a slight smile. Congratulations on your engagement. Ryder, when you're ready to discuss that expansion loan we talked about last year, come see me. I think you'll find my terms very reasonable. After he left, the shop erupted in amazed chatter. Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the rapid reversal of fortune. In the space of an hour, Daniel had been cleared of murder charges. They'd announced their engagement, and Wilfred had been thoroughly defeated. Why? She asked Tom Martinez. Why did Thornton do that? Tom grinned. Because Thornton's got a daughter back east with red hair. Redder than yours even. He's been fighting that prejudice his whole life. When he heard what Wilfred did to you, he was furious. Just took him a while to figure out how to act on it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Word of the engagement spread through Willow Creek like wildfire, and the shop saw a steady stream of visitors. Some came to congratulate, others to gawk, but by evening it felt as if the entire town had passed through. Eleanor was exhausted but exhilarated when Daniel finally closed the shop. They stood together in the sudden quiet, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the evidence of their shared future. We never got that proper courting dinner, Daniel said ruefully. I think we skipped straight past courting to engaged, Eleanor replied with a laugh. Though I wouldn't mind dinner. I'm starving. They went to the hotel dining room where Martha had saved them the best table and cooked what she called an engagement feast: roast beef, potatoes, green beans from someone's garden, and a cake that appeared as if by magic. How did you have time to make this? Eleanor asked in amazement. Martha winked. I've been expecting this since the day Daniel carried your trunk into my hotel. Man looked at you like you hung the moon. Just a matter of time. They ate slowly, savoring both the food and the peace after the chaos of the day. Around them, the dining room's other patrons offered quiet congratulations or simply smiled in their direction. It was acceptance, Eleanor realized. Real acceptance, not just tolerance. Tell me about your parents, Daniel said eventually. What would they think of all this? Eleanor considered the question. My mother would be thrilled. She always said I needed someone strong enough to match my stubbornness. My father. She smiled sadly. My father would have liked you. He valued hard work and honesty above everything else. He would have respected what you've built here. I wish I could have met them, Daniel said sincerely. Asked for your hand properly. You're asking me properly, Eleanor pointed out. Just in a different order than usual. Everything about us has been in a different order, Daniel agreed. Meeting because of another man's rejection, working together before courting, getting engaged in a blacksmith shop with half the town watching. Would you change it? Eleanor asked curiously. Daniel reached across the table to take her hand. Not a single thing. Every step, even the painful ones, led us here. Led me to you. They talked late into the evening, making plans for the wedding, for the shop expansion, for the life they would build together. Eleanor learned that Daniel wanted children, as many as we're blessed with, and that he'd been saving money for years, enough to build a proper house, instead of living in the rooms behind his shop. Where would you want to live? He asked. In town or outside it? Close enough to walk to the shop, Eleanor said practically. But with enough land for a garden. I miss having growing things around me. There's a plot for sale at the edge of town, Daniel said eagerly. 5 acres with a creek running through it. I've had my eye on it for years, just never had a reason to buy it before. Now you do, Eleanor said softly. Now I do, he agreed. Sunday's church service was standing room only. Word of Wilfred's required apology had spread throughout the valley, and no one wanted to miss the spectacle. Eleanor sat with Daniel in what was becoming their usual pew, trying to ignore the weight of all those watching eyes. Reverend Phillips conducted the service as usual, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation that made even the hymns feel charged. Finally, just before the closing prayer, he called Wilfred forward. Wilfred looked as if he'd aged 10 years in a week. His usual immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, his pompous bearing deflated. He stood at the pulpit for a long moment, visibly struggling with the words. "I have something to say," he finally began, his voice barely audible. "I owe an apology to Miss Eleanor McKenna and Mr. Daniel Ryder." The church was so quiet Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat. "I behaved badly," Wilfred continued, stronger now, but still obviously hating every word. "I rejected Miss McKenna for superficial reasons, and then persecuted both her and Mr. Ryder out of wounded pride. This was wrong of me, and I ask their forgiveness." He looked directly at Eleanor and Daniel, and she saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not just humiliation, but a flicker of genuine regret. "I also ask the forgiveness of this congregation for the division and strife I've caused," Wilfred added, which wasn't part of what Thornton had required. "I've let pride and prejudice guide my actions, and I've been humbled by the consequences. I hope we can all move forward from this." He stepped down from the pulpit and walked back to his pew with as much dignity as he could muster. The silence held for another moment. Then Reverend Phillips spoke. "Forgiveness is divine," he said simply, "as is the courage to admit our wrongs. Let us pray." After the service, Eleanor found herself facing Wilfred in the churchyard. Daniel tensed beside her, ready to intervene, but she touched his arm gently. "Mr. Hargrave?" she said formally. "Miss McKenna," he replied, not quite meeting her eyes. What I said in there, I meant it. Not just because Thornton forced me, but this week has shown me some things about myself I don't much like." Eleanor studied him for a moment, this man who had caused her so much pain and inadvertently led her to so much joy. "I forgive you," she said simply. "We both need to move forward." Wilfred nodded jerkily, then surprised them both by offering his hand to Daniel. "Ryder, good luck with the expansion. The town needs a proper hardware store." Daniel shook his hand briefly. "Thank you." Wilfred walked away quickly, his shoulders hunched, and Eleanor felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. He would recover from this, his store, his position in town, but he would never again be the social arbiter he'd once imagined himself to be. "That was generous of you," Daniel said quietly. "Holding on to anger would only poison our happiness," Eleanor replied. "Besides, in a strange way, we owe him. If he hadn't rejected me, I'd still be alone in my shop, drowning in receipts and loneliness," Daniel finished. "You're right. Maybe we should invite him to the wedding." Eleanor laughed. "Let's not go that far." The next weeks flew by in a whirlwind of preparation. Sarah Morrison took charge of the wedding planning with military efficiency, delegating tasks to half the women in town. Eleanor found herself swept along by their enthusiasm, only occasionally managing to assert her own preferences. The house Daniel had mentioned was purchased, and work began immediately on making it livable. It needed significant repair, but the bones were good. Solid construction, large rooms, plenty of windows to let in light. Daniel worked on it every evening after closing the shop, and Eleanor often joined him, learning to sand wood and patch walls. "You don't have to do this," Daniel said one evening as they worked side by side to repair the kitchen cabinets. "It's hard work." "I want to," Eleanor insisted, though her arms ached and she had splinters in places she didn't know could get splinters. "This is our home. I want to help build it." He kissed her then, dusty and sweaty as they both were, and Eleanor thought it was better than any fancy courtship could have been. 2 weeks before the wedding, Eleanor received a letter from Boston. Her cousin Mary had finally replied to her earlier letter. Eleanor opened it with trembling hands, afraid of what judgment it might contain. "Dearest Eleanor," it read, "your letter was the most romantic thing I've ever read. To think you traveled all that way to marry one man and found true love with another. It's like something from a novel. I've enclosed a small gift for your wedding, Mother's pearl necklace. She always said it should go to you, and I can't think of a better occasion. Be happy, cousin. You deserve it after everything you've been through." Eleanor cried over the letter, clutching the pearl necklace that had arrived with it. It was the blessing she hadn't known she needed, the connection to her old life that made her new life feel complete. The shop expansion was also underway, funded by Thornton's generous loan. Daniel hired 2 apprentices, young men eager to learn the trade, and Eleanor set up a proper accounting system that would track inventory for the new hardware section. They worked as partners in every sense, building something larger than either could have managed alone. One evening, as they stood in their partially renovated house watching the sunset through the new windows Daniel had installed, Eleanor was struck by how much had changed in just 6 weeks. "Do you ever think about how different this all could have been?" she asked. Daniel's arms came around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. "Every day. If that stagecoach had been a day late, if I'd been out of town when you arrived, if any one of 1,000 things had been different. We might never have met," Eleanor finished. "Or we might have met differently," Daniel suggested. "Maybe I would have seen you at church with Wilfred and known I'd lost my chance. Maybe you would have been a respectable merchant's wife, and I would have just been the blacksmith who shoed your horses." Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "That would have been tragic." "The real tragedy would have been never knowing what we could have been together," Daniel said seriously. "Never knowing that someone could see past my guilt and grief to the man underneath. Never knowing that red hair really does burn brighter than the sun." Their wedding day dawned clear and perfect, one of those rare October days when the air was crisp but the sun was warm. Eleanor stood in her room at the hotel, her last morning in this tiny space that had been her refuge, and looked at herself in the mirror. Sarah had worked magic with her hair, weaving it into an elaborate style adorned with small white flowers. The dress was her mother's, after all. Mary had sent it from Boston despite Eleanor's protest that it had been sold. "I bought it back," Mary's note had said. Every bride should have something of her mother's on her wedding day. The ivory silk had yellowed slightly with age, but it still fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. The pearl necklace lay cool against her throat, and Eleanor thought she could feel her parents' presence, their blessing on this unexpected path her life had taken. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Patterson said from the doorway. The older woman's eyes were suspiciously bright, like something out of a fairy tale. "Fairy tales don't usually start with mail-order bride rejections," Eleanor said with a nervous laugh. "The best ones do," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "The ones where the heroine has to fight for her happiness instead of having it handed to her. Those are the stories worth telling." The church was packed to overflowing. It seemed the entire valley had come to witness the wedding of the year, the scandal that had become a love story, the rejection that had led to redemption. Eleanor stood at the back of the church, her arm linked with Tom Martinez's. He'd volunteered to give her away, saying someone needed to make sure. Wilfred behaved and looked down the aisle to where Daniel waited. He was wearing a new suit, properly fitted this time, and his face when he saw her. Eleanor's breath caught. No one had ever looked at her like that, as if she were precious and perfect and absolutely essential to their existence. The walk down the aisle seemed both endless and too quick. Then she was standing beside Daniel, his hand reaching for hers, and Reverend Phillips was speaking words about love and commitment and building a life together. "Do you, Daniel, take Eleanor to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, from this day forward until death do you part?" "I do," Daniel said, his voice strong and certain. "Do you, Eleanor, take Daniel to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, from this day forward until death do you part?" "I do," Eleanor said, her voice clear despite the tears threatening to fall. "Then by the power vested in me by God in the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was tender and thorough, appropriate for church, but promising more, and the congregation erupted in cheers. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Eleanor caught sight of Wilfred Hargrave in a back pew. He nodded slightly, something like acceptance in his expression, and she nodded back. The past was past. The future was what mattered now. The reception in the hotel dining room was a blur of congratulations, food, music, and dancing. Eleanor danced with her husband, and thought about the strange journey that had brought them together. A woman with red hair that burned like sunrise, rejected for superstition. A man carrying 7 years of guilt for a crime he didn't commit. Both of them broken in different ways, both of them healing through finding each other. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked as they swayed together to a slow waltz. "About how Wilfred said my hair was the devil's mark," Eleanor said, "and how wrong he was. It wasn't a curse. It was a beacon calling me home to you." Daniel's hand came up to touch a strand that had escaped her elaborate hairstyle. "It was the first thing I noticed about you, like fire in the sunlight. I thought if a woman could wear that color so proudly, she could handle anything. Even a blacksmith with a mysterious past?" "Especially that," Daniel said with a smile. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? The rejected bride and the suspected murderer." "Former rejected bride," Eleanor corrected, "and falsely suspected murderer. Now we're just Daniel and Eleanor Ryder, proprietors of Ryder's Blacksmith and Hardware, pillars of the community." "I like the sound of that," Daniel said, spinning her gently. "Though I like the sound of Daniel and Eleanor Ryder even more." As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Eleanor and Daniel prepared to depart for their new home. Sarah had organized the women to prepare it while they were at the reception. Beds made with new linens, flowers in every room, the kitchen stocked with food. They rode through the quiet streets of Willow Creek in a small carriage decorated with ribbons and flowers, waving at the few people still out. Their house stood at the edge of town, windows glowing with lamplight, looking like everything Eleanor had dreamed of when she'd first answered that mail-order bride advertisement. But as Daniel carried her over the threshold, insisting on the tradition despite her laughing protests, Eleanor realized this was nothing like what she'd dreamed. This was better. She'd thought she wanted security and respectability, a safe life with a practical arrangement. Instead, she'd found passion and partnership, a love that had been forged in the fire of adversity and made stronger for it. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ryder," Daniel said, setting her gently on her feet in their front parlor. "Welcome home, Mr. Ryder," Eleanor replied, reaching up to frame his face with her hands. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me that first day. Really seeing me, not just the red hair or the scandal, but me. For giving me work when I had nothing, for standing by me against the whole town, for loving me." Daniel's eyes were bright with emotion. "Thank you for being brave enough to stay, for bringing order to my chaos, for believing in me when my past caught up with me, for seeing something worth loving in a broken blacksmith." "We're neither of us broken anymore," Eleanor said softly. "We're whole. Together." Outside, a wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the young trees Daniel had planted along their property line. But inside, all was warm and safe and perfect. Eleanor McKenna, who had come west to marry a merchant and been rejected for her red hair, was now Eleanor Ryder, wife of the town blacksmith, keeper of his books and his heart. The lamp flames flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and Eleanor thought they looked like the patterns Daniel made with his hammer and forge, random strikes that somehow came together to create something beautiful and lasting. That's what their love was, she realized. Not the neat planned arrangement she thought she wanted, but something forged in fire, shaped by adversity, and all the stronger for it. The first winter of their marriage arrived with unexpected ferocity, blanketing Willow Creek in snow that reached the windowsills. Eleanor stood in the kitchen of their home, kneading bread dough while watching Daniel through the frost-etched window as he cleared a path to the shop. 6 months had passed since their wedding, and the rhythm of their life together had settled into something both comfortable and challenging. "You're going to wear a hole in that dough," Sarah Morrison said from her seat by the stove, where she'd come to escape her own house full of sick children. "What's troubling you?" Eleanor paused in her kneading, flour dusting her arms up to the elbows. "I received a letter yesterday from Boston. My father's former employer wants to offer me a position. Says they need someone with my bookkeeping skills to manage their Western expansion office." Sarah's eyebrows rose. That's quite an opportunity. What did Daniel say? I haven't told him yet. Eleanor resumed her kneading with perhaps more force than necessary. How can I? He's just finished the shop expansion. We've just gotten the house properly furnished, and now… She trailed off, unable to voice the secret she'd been carrying for 2 weeks. And now you're expecting, Sarah said quietly, her trained eye missing nothing. How far along? Eleanor's hands stilled. 2 months, maybe a little more. I haven't even told Daniel yet. I wanted to be sure, and then this letter came, and everything feels so complicated suddenly. Sarah rose and put her arm around Eleanor's shoulders. Life has a way of doing that, throwing everything at you at once to see how you'll handle it. But Eleanor, that man adores you. Whatever you decide about the Boston offer, whatever concerns you have about the baby, he'll support you. Before Eleanor could respond, the door burst open with a swirl of snow and cold air. Daniel entered, his cheeks red from the wind, but his expression was troubled. We've got a problem, he said without preamble, then noticed Sarah. Good. You're here. We might need James. There's been an accident at the Pinkerton Ranch. Wagon overturned in the snow, Robert's trapped underneath, and his leg. Daniel shook his head grimly. Sarah was already reaching for her coat. I'll get James and meet you there. Eleanor, prepare the shop in case we need to bring him in. Clean blankets, hot water, clear the work table. Within minutes, Eleanor found herself alone, mechanically following Sarah's instructions while her mind raced. Robert Pinkerton, the pompous young man who'd tried to court her at the barn dance, was injured. Despite his arrogance, he didn't deserve to suffer. She built up the fire in the forge until the shop was warm, laid out Daniel's cleanest drop cloths on the main work table, and set water to boiling. 2 hours passed before she heard the sound of horses and urgent voices. Daniel appeared first, carrying one end of a makeshift stretcher, Tom Martinez at the other end. Robert Pinkerton lay between them, his face gray with pain and blood loss, his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. Dr. Morrison followed close behind, his medical bag in hand, Sarah at his side. Get him on the table, the doctor ordered tersely. Sarah, I need more light. Eleanor, keep that water coming. What followed was one of the longest afternoons of Eleanor's life. She assisted where she could, holding lanterns, fetching supplies, while Dr. Morrison worked to save Robert's leg. Daniel and Tom held the young man down during the worst of it, when the doctor had to reset the bone. Robert's screams echoed through the shop, making Eleanor's stomach turn. You don't have to stay, Daniel said quietly when he saw her face. This isn't something you should have to see. I'm staying, Eleanor said firmly, though she had to swallow hard against nausea. He needs all the help he can get. It was nearly dark when Dr. Morrison finally stepped back, exhausted. I've done what I can. The leg might heal straight if he's lucky and does exactly as I say, but he'll need constant care for the next few weeks, and his father's laid up with a bad back. He can stay here, Daniel said immediately. We've got the spare room, and Eleanor and I can take turns watching him. Eleanor felt a surge of love for her husband, offering shelter to a man who'd been nothing but dismissive of him. Of course he can stay, she agreed. Robert's recovery became the focus of their lives for the next month. He was a terrible patient at first, demanding and petulant, complaining about everything from the food to the roughness of the sheets. But gradually, as he observed Daniel and Eleanor's partnership, their easy affection and shared labor, something in him began to change. I was wrong about you, Robert said one afternoon when Eleanor brought him soup. His leg was healing well, though he still couldn't put weight on it. Both of you. I thought Ryder was just a glorified laborer, and you were… He flushed. Well, I had bought into Hargrave's poison about your character. We all make mistakes in judgment, Eleanor said diplomatically. No, this was more than that, Robert insisted. I've been watching you two. The way you work together, support each other. My parents barely speak except to argue about money or land. I thought that was just how marriage was. But you and Daniel, you actually like each other. Eleanor smiled. We do. Though we have our disagreements too. Just yesterday we argued for an hour about whether to expand the garden or build a larger chicken coop. What did you decide? Both, eventually. The garden this spring, the chicken coop in summer. Eleanor adjusted his pillows. Marriage is about compromise, Robert. and about seeing your partner as an equal, not a possession or a prize. Robert was quiet for a moment. I owe you an apology for the barn dance, for pursuing you like you were some sort of trophy to be won. You're a person with your own mind and heart, and I didn't see that. Apology accepted, Eleanor said, surprised by his sincerity. Now eat your soup before it gets cold. It was that evening, after Robert was settled for the night, that Eleanor finally told Daniel about both the letter from Boston and the baby. They were sitting by their bedroom fire, Daniel working on plans for a custom gate, while Eleanor mended one of his work shirts. I need to tell you something, she began, her heart racing. 2 things, actually. Daniel set down his pencil immediately, his full attention on her. What is it? Eleanor took a breath. First, I received a letter from Boston. Harriman and Associates, my father's old firm. They want to offer me a position managing their Western expansion office. It would mean traveling to Denver, San Francisco, managing significant accounts. Daniel's face went carefully neutral. That's a tremendous opportunity. What did you tell them? Nothing yet. I wanted to talk to you first. Eleanor set aside her mending. But there's more. Daniel, I'm expecting. The baby should come in late summer. The transformation of Daniel's face was something Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. Joy, wonder, and fear all flashed across his features before he was out of his chair and kneeling beside hers, his hands reaching tentatively toward her still flat stomach. A baby? He whispered. Our baby. Our baby, Eleanor confirmed, covering his hands with hers, which makes the Boston offer even more complicated. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his hands warm against her belly. What do you want to do? I don't know, Eleanor admitted. Part of me is flattered they thought of me, proud that my skills are recognized, but the thought of leaving Willow Creek, leaving our home, our life here, and with a baby coming. If you want to take the position, we'll make it work, Daniel said firmly. I can sell the shop, start over somewhere else. Your career matters too, Eleanor. The fact that he would offer such a sacrifice without hesitation made Eleanor's eyes fill with tears. You would do that? Leave everything you've built here? I'd follow you anywhere, Daniel said simply. You saved me, Eleanor. From loneliness, from guilt, from a half-life of work without joy. If Boston or Denver or San Francisco is where you need to be, then that's where we'll go. Eleanor slipped from her chair to kneel beside him, taking his face in her hands. My darling, wonderful man, don't you understand? I already have everything I want right here. A husband I adore, work that challenges me, a community that's finally accepted us, and now a baby on the way. The Boston offer is flattering, but it's not my dream anymore. Are you sure? Daniel searched her face. I don't want you to give up opportunities because of me. I'm not giving up anything, Eleanor said firmly. I'm choosing the life I want, and that life is here, with you, building our family and our business together. Daniel pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. A baby, he said again, wonder in his voice. After Margaret and our daughter, I never thought I'd have another chance at fatherhood. Are you frightened? Eleanor asked against his shoulder. Terrified, Daniel admitted, but also happier than I've been since you agreed to marry me. He pulled back to look at her. We should tell Sarah tomorrow, get you proper care. Already done. She diagnosed me before I could tell her. Eleanor smiled. She says everything looks perfect so far. They sat together by the fire, making plans for the nursery, discussing names, dreaming of the future. Neither of them noticed Robert Pinkerton standing in the hallway on his new crutches, having heard everything. The young man made his way carefully back to his room, his mind working on plans of his own. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Wilfred Hargrave stood at their door, hat in hand, his usual arrogance replaced by something Eleanor had never seen before, humility. I need your help, he said without preamble. Both of you. Daniel and Eleanor exchanged glances. Come in, Daniel said after a moment. It's cold. Wilfred entered their home for the first time, his eyes taking in the comfortable furnishings, the evidence of a happy life being built. He accepted coffee with mumbled thanks and sat stiffly in the offered chair. My sister is coming to visit, he began, then stopped, seeming to gather courage. My younger sister, Julia. She's in trouble. Her husband died 6 months ago, leaving her with 3 children and significant debts. She's lost everything. I'm sorry to hear that, Eleanor said sincerely. She's coming here because she has nowhere else to go, Wilfred continued. But I don't know anything about children, and Julia, she's proud. She won't want charity, especially not from me. We haven't been close since our parents died. What do you need from us? Daniel asked directly. Wilfred's hands clenched around his coffee cup. A job. For Julia. She's educated, good with numbers like you, Eleanor. And maybe you could help me figure out how to be a proper uncle to her children. I know I have no right to ask after everything I've done. You're right, you don't, Eleanor said, making Wilfred flinch. But family is family, and children shouldn't suffer for adult feuds. When does she arrive? Next week, Wilfred said, hope creeping into his voice. Bring her by the shop, Daniel said. We can use another bookkeeper with the expansion, and Eleanor will need help when... He caught himself, but Wilfred had noticed the pause. When what? Wilfred asked. Then his eyes widened as he took in Eleanor's protective hand on her stomach, the glow in her cheeks. You're expecting. We are, Eleanor confirmed, lifting her chin as if daring him to make a disparaging comment. But Wilfred only nodded slowly. Congratulations. Children are a blessing. His voice carried unexpected wistfulness. After he left, with promises to bring Julia by the following week, Eleanor turned to Daniel. That was unexpected. The whole world's gone topsy-turvy, Daniel agreed. Robert Pinkerton learning humility, Wilfred Hargrave asking for help. What's next? What was next arrived 3 days later in the form of a telegram from Denver. The Colorado and Western Railroad Company was planning a spur line that would pass through Willow Creek, bringing commerce and growth to the valley. The town would need to modernize quickly, proper suppliers, expanded businesses, infrastructure to handle the influx of people and goods. This changes everything, Tom Martinez said at the emergency town meeting. We're talking about Willow Creek becoming a real hub, not just a frontier outpost. We'll need more than one blacksmith, someone called out, and a proper hardware store, not just the corner of Ryder's shop. Daniel stood. I've been thinking about this since the telegram arrived. Eleanor and I have a proposal. We form a cooperative, multiple businesses working together. I'll focus on the smithing and train apprentices. Eleanor will manage the books for all of us, ensuring fair prices and shared prosperity. We bring in specialists for different trades. Instead of competing, we collaborate. That's socialist talk, someone grumbled. That's smart business, Banker Thornton corrected. The railroad won't wait for us to figure this out. We work together, or we get left behind. The debate raged for hours, but eventually Daniel's vision won out. The Willow Creek Commerce Cooperative was formed, with Eleanor as its chief financial officer, a title that made her laugh even as she accepted the responsibility. Julia Hargrave arrived the following week, a thin woman with tired eyes and 3 children clinging to her skirts. She had Wilfred's sharp features, but none of his harshness, and her gratitude when Eleanor offered her work was painful to witness. I was a teacher before I married, Julia explained, but I kept my husband's books too. I can learn whatever you need me to know. You'll do wonderfully, Eleanor assured her, and the children can play in the yard behind the shop while you work. Daniel's building a swing set. Julia's eyes filled with tears. Wilfred said you were kind, but I didn't expect, not after how he treated you. That's in the past, Eleanor said firmly. We look forward here, not back. Spring arrived with its usual mixture of mud and promise. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Daniel's protective hovering sometimes drove her to distraction. I'm pregnant, not porcelain, she said in exasperation when he tried to prevent her from carrying a ledger across the shop. You're carrying our child, Daniel countered. That makes you precious beyond measure. Robert Pinkerton, now fully healed and a surprisingly frequent visitor to the shop, laughed from his perch on a stool. Give up, Eleanor. My father was the same way with my mother. Men go a little crazy when babies are involved. The strange friendship that had developed between Robert and the Ryders was one of the town's favorite topics of gossip. The spoiled rancher's son who'd learned humility, the blacksmith who'd shown grace to someone who'd dismissed him, the red-haired woman who'd forgiven past insults. It was like something out of the serialized novels that arrived on the monthly supply wagon. "I have news," Robert announced one afternoon in late May. "I'm getting married." Eleanor nearly dropped the inkwell she was holding. "To whom?" "Julia Hargrave," Robert said, his face flushing. "I know it's sudden, but we've been corresponding since she started working here, and, well, she's nothing like I expected. She's brilliant and kind, and she makes me want to be better than I am." Daniel and Eleanor exchanged glances. They'd noticed Robert finding excuses to visit on days when Julia was working, had seen the way Julia's face lit up when he arrived. But marriage? "Have you spoken to Wilfred?" Daniel asked carefully. "This morning," Robert confirmed. He nearly had apoplexy, but Julia stood up to him, told him she was a grown woman who'd already had one marriage arranged for security. This time she was choosing love. "And your father?" Eleanor asked. Robert's expression darkened slightly. "He'll come around. He wants grandchildren to carry on the ranch legacy. Julia's children need a father. It works out for everyone." But Eleanor heard what he didn't say, that he genuinely loved Julia, that this wasn't just a practical arrangement, but a meeting of hearts that had both been bruised by life. The wedding was set for July, a month before Eleanor's baby was due. The whole town threw itself into preparations with the enthusiasm of people who'd been starved for good news. The railroad construction was proceeding on schedule, the cooperative was thriving, and now two of their prominent families were joining together. Eleanor found herself working closely with Julia on both the wedding plans and the cooperative's books. The woman was indeed brilliant, with a quick mind for figures and a talent for seeing patterns Eleanor might have missed. "You've been so kind to me," Julia said one afternoon as they reviewed the quarterly reports. "After what Wilfred did to you, you had every right to turn us away." "Holding on to anger is like holding on to hot coal," Eleanor replied, something her mother used to say. "You're the only one who gets burned." Still, not everyone would have been so forgiving. Julia paused, then added quietly, "Robert told me about the Boston offer. About how you chose to stay here instead." Eleanor's hand went to her rounded belly. "It wasn't a hard choice in the end. Everything I love is here." "I understand that now," Julia said. "When I first arrived, I thought Willow Creek was the end of the world, a place to hide until I could figure out how to get back to civilization. But now, Robert's shown me there's a different kind of life here. Harder in some ways, but more honest, more real." The wedding day dawned hot and clear. Eleanor, now heavily pregnant, stood as Julia's matron of honor, trying not to waddle too obviously down the aisle. Robert waited at the altar, his face shining with joy, while Wilfred gave his sister away with surprising grace. "Who would have thought," Sarah Morrison whispered to Eleanor during the reception, "that Wilfred Hargrave would become part of your extended family?" "Life has a strange sense of humor," Eleanor agreed, watching Wilfred dance with Julia's youngest daughter, his stern face softened by genuine affection. It was later that evening, as the celebration continued, that Eleanor felt the first pain. She dismissed it as discomfort from standing too long, but when the second one came, stronger and more insistent, she gripped Daniel's arm. I think the baby's coming." The next hours were a blur of pain and effort, with Sarah and Dr. Morrison attending while Daniel paced outside like a caged bear. Eleanor could hear him through the door, wearing a groove in their hallway floor, and wanted to call out to him, but another contraction stole her breath. "You're doing beautifully," Sarah encouraged. "Not much longer now." As dawn broke over Willow Creek, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Eleanor of that first sunset when she'd arrived, their son was born. He came into the world with a lusty cry and a shock of red hair that made everyone in the room laugh through their tears. "He's perfect," Daniel breathed when he was finally allowed in, his large hands trembling as he took his son for the first time. "Red hair and all." "Red hair especially," Eleanor corrected, exhausted but euphoric. "It's his inheritance. A mark of the fire within." They named him James Thomas Ryder. James for Dr. Morrison, who'd saved Robert's leg and delivered their son safely, Thomas for Tom Martinez, who'd stood by them from the beginning. The town's response to the birth was overwhelming. Gifts arrived daily, hand-sewn blankets, carved toys, enough preserved food to last through winter. Even Wilfred sent a beautiful silver rattle with a note of congratulations. "It's as if the whole town is adopting him," Eleanor said in wonder, sorting through the latest offerings. "In a way they are," Daniel replied, gently rocking James in the chair he'd built specially for this purpose. "This little one represents hope. New beginnings. The future we're all building together." The railroad arrived in September, bringing with it the promised chaos and opportunity. The quiet frontier town Eleanor had first encountered was transformed almost overnight into a bustling center of commerce. New businesses opened weekly, houses sprang up like mushrooms after rain, and the dusty main street was paved with proper boards. Through it all, the Ryder blacksmith shop and hardware remained the heart of the community. Daniel's forge never went cold, with orders backed up for weeks. Eleanor managed the books for a dozen businesses now, with Julia as her capable assistant. Little James spent his days in a specially built pen in the corner of the office, watched over by whoever had a free moment. "He's going to grow up thinking the sound of hammering is a lullaby," Eleanor said one afternoon, watching their son sleep peacefully despite the racket from the forge. "There are worse sounds to grow up with," Daniel replied, taking a break to kiss both wife and son. "He's growing up with the sound of things being built, being made better." That's not a bad start in life. 1 year after the railroad's arrival, Willow Creek was unrecognizable. The population had tripled, a proper school had been built, with Julia as head teacher, and there was even talk of incorporating as a proper city. Eleanor stood in the doorway of their expanded shop, now occupying 3 buildings, and marveled at the changes. "Do you miss it?" Daniel asked, coming up behind her. "The quiet little town where we met?" Eleanor considered the question. That town had been where she'd faced rejection, where she'd been called a witch for her red hair, where she'd had to fight for acceptance and respect. But it had also been where she'd found Daniel, where they'd built their love story against all odds. "No," she said finally. "That town served its purpose. It brought us together, tested us, made us stronger. But this," she gestured at the bustling street, "this is what we're building for James and his siblings." "Siblings?" Daniel's voice rose hopefully. Eleanor turned in his arms, smiling. "Sarah confirmed it this morning. Another baby, due in spring." Daniel lifted her off her feet, spinning her around until she laughed and demanded to be put down. Several passers-by smiled at the display, well accustomed now to the rider's open affection. "Another red-headed baby?" Daniel asked hopefully. "We'll have to wait and see," Eleanor replied. "Though I hope so. This town could use more fire." That evening, they held one of their regular dinners for their extended chosen family. Robert and Julia Pinkerton were there with Julia's children and their new baby. Wilfred, who'd become an unexpectedly doting uncle and grandfather figure. Sarah and Dr. Morrison, whose own children were now grown. Tom Martinez and his wife. Even Mrs. Patterson from the hotel, her stern face soft as she held baby James. "A toast," Robert proposed, raising his glass, "to second chances and unexpected blessings." "To the woman who changed everything," Wilfred added, surprising everyone by looking directly at Eleanor. "If I hadn't been a fool about red hair, none of this would have happened. My rejection was the best thing that ever happened to this town." "To Eleanor," the room chorused, and she felt tears prick her eyes. "To all of us," she corrected. "To the community we've built, the families we've chosen, the future we're creating together." As the evening wound down and their guests departed, Eleanor and Daniel sat on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear Wyoming sky. James slept peacefully in Eleanor's arms, his red hair glinting in the lamplight. "I received another letter from Boston today," Eleanor said quietly. "They've doubled their offer. Senior partnership, my own office, a house in the best neighborhood." Daniel tensed beside her. And I wrote back declining," Eleanor said, smiling at his obvious relief. "I told them I already have a senior partnership in the Willow Creek Commerce Cooperative, an office in the finest blacksmith shop in Wyoming, and a house filled with more love than any Boston neighborhood could offer." "You're sure?" Daniel asked, though his arm tightened around her shoulders. "I've never been more sure of anything," Eleanor replied. This is our home, Daniel. This is where our story continues. 5 years passed in what seemed like a heartbeat. The shop had become Ryder and Associates, employing a dozen people. Eleanor managed the business side while Daniel trained apprentices in the art of blacksmithing. They had 3 children now, James with his mother's red hair, Anna with Daniel's dark locks, and baby Thomas, who seemed to be deciding between the two. The town had grown into a small city, with proper streets, a theater, and even a small hospital that Dr. Morrison ran with characteristic efficiency. The prejudice against red hair had become something of a town joke. Newcomers who expressed such sentiments were quickly educated about how Eleanor Ryder's red hair had been the catalyst for Willow Creek's transformation. "Mama, tell us the story," 5-year-old James demanded one evening as the family gathered before bed. "Which story?" Eleanor asked, though she knew. "The one about the lady with red hair who came on the stagecoach," Anna chimed in. Eleanor settled into her chair by the fire, baby Thomas in her arms, while Daniel sat nearby, his face soft with love and memory. "Once upon a time," Eleanor began, "a young woman with hair the color of sunset came to a frontier town, hoping to marry a merchant. But the merchant was foolish and afraid. He saw her beautiful red hair and called it a curse." "Silly man," James pronounced with all the wisdom of his 5 years. "Very silly," Eleanor agreed. But his rejection was actually a gift, because it allowed the woman to meet a blacksmith. A kind, strong man who saw her red hair and said it burned brighter than the sun. "Like Papa," Anna exclaimed. "Exactly like Papa," Eleanor confirmed, meeting Daniel's eyes over the children's heads. And together, the woman and the blacksmith built a life filled with love and laughter, with friends who became family, and with children who would carry their story forward. "And her red hair?" James asked, though he knew this part by heart. "Her red hair became a symbol of strength, of the fire within that refuses to be dimmed by others' fears or prejudices. It became a beacon, calling others who'd been rejected or dismissed to come and build something better." As she finished the story and Daniel carried the older children to bed, Eleanor stood at the window, looking out at the town they'd helped build. Somewhere out there, other red-haired children played without fear of being called witches. Other mail-order brides arrived to find love in unexpected places. Other people running from their pasts discovered futures they'd never imagined. Daniel joined her at the window, his arms coming around her from behind, careful of the sleeping baby. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Eleanor leaned back against his solid warmth. "How could I regret the path that led me to you? To this life? To our children? Even though it started with rejection? With pain?" Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd seen her truly from the very beginning. "Especially because it started that way. The finest steel goes through the hottest fire. You taught me that. We were forged by those early trials, made stronger by them." "My wise wife," Daniel murmured, kissing her forehead. "My beautiful, red-haired wife, who burns brighter than the sun." "Your wife who was once rejected for that very hair," Eleanor reminded him with a smile. "Thank God for foolish men," Daniel said fervently. "If Wilfred had been sensible, you'd be a merchant's wife right now, probably miserable and definitely not mine." "I was always meant to be yours," Eleanor said with certainty. "It just took a rather circuitous route to get here." As they stood together, watching the lights of Willow Creek twinkle like earthbound stars, Eleanor thought about the woman she'd been when she'd stepped off that stagecoach, frightened, alone, desperate for security and acceptance. That woman could never have imagined this life, the thriving business, the loving family, the community that had embraced what others had rejected. But perhaps that was the point. Sometimes the greatest blessings came disguised as the worst disasters. Sometimes rejection was just redirection toward something better. And sometimes a woman with red hair that burned like fire was exactly what a grieving blacksmith and a struggling frontier town needed to forge a better future. The sound of a hammer striking iron drifted from somewhere in the city, one of Daniel's apprentices working late, perhaps, or another blacksmith inspired by their success. It was the sound of building, of creating, of making something from nothing. It was the sound that had punctuated their courtship, their marriage, their children's lives. It was the sound of home. Eleanor rested her head against Daniel's chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady and strong as hammer strikes, and knew that every rejection, every hardship, every moment of doubt had been worth it to arrive at this moment, this life, this love. Outside, the moon rose over Willow Creek, painting the world in silver and shadow. But inside the Ryder home, all was golden warmth and contentment, a testament to the power of seeing beauty where others saw only strangeness, of choosing love over fear, and of building something extraordinary from the ashes of what was meant to be ordinary. The red-haired woman who'd been rejected for a perceived curse had become the blessing that transformed an entire town. And in the years that followed, when people asked how Willow Creek had grown from a dusty frontier outpost to a thriving city, old-timers would smile and say, "It all started with a woman whose hair burned brighter than the sun, and a blacksmith wise enough to see that fire as warmth rather than danger." 20 years had transformed more than just Willow Creek. Eleanor stood before the mirror in their bedroom, studying the silver threads that now wove through her still vibrant red hair. At 43, she carried herself with a confidence that the frightened young woman stepping off that stagecoach could never have imagined. The sound of laughter drifted up from the yard below where Daniel was teaching their youngest, 10-year-old Thomas, the finer points of horseshoe making. "You're going to be late for the ceremony," Daniel called up, his voice still capable of making her heart skip after all these years. The ceremony. Eleanor smiled at her reflection, adjusting the emerald green dress she'd chosen for the occasion. Today, the town of Willow Creek was officially recognizing her as their first female mayor, a position she'd been reluctantly persuaded to accept after years of essentially running the town's commerce anyway. "Mama, you look beautiful," Anna said from the doorway. At 17, she was the image of her mother at that age, though her hair was dark like Daniel's. "James is already at the town hall with Margaret. He's nervous as a cat." Eleanor's eldest son, James, now 25, had married Margaret Collins just last year, the daughter of the same family whose locket Daniel had repaired for free so many years ago. Life had a way of weaving circles, Eleanor thought, connecting moments across decades in ways that only made sense when you looked back. "Tell him there's nothing to be nervous about," Eleanor said, pinning her mother's cameo brooch to her collar. "He's giving a speech, not facing a firing squad." "You know James," Anna said with fond exasperation. "He'd rather face the firing squad. He's got your red hair, but Papa's preference for working with his hands over talking." Eleanor made her way downstairs where Daniel waited, still imposing at 50, though his dark hair was now liberally salted with gray. He'd put on his best suit, the one he wore for weddings and funerals, and Eleanor's breath caught at how handsome he still was. 20 years, he said softly, taking her hands. 20 years since you walked into my shop and changed everything." 21, actually, Eleanor corrected with a smile. "You always forget that first year." "I never forget it," Daniel said, pulling her close. "I just can't believe I've been lucky enough to have you for so long." They walked through the streets of Willow Creek together, and Eleanor marveled at how much had changed. The dusty frontier town was now a proper city with paved streets, electric streetlights just installed last year, and buildings that rose 3 and 4 stories high. The Ryder blacksmith shop still anchored the commercial district, though it had evolved into Ryder Industries, manufacturing everything from farming equipment to decorative ironwork that was shipped across the country. "Grandmama! Grandpapa!" A small red-headed missile launched itself at their legs. 5-year-old Elizabeth, James and Margaret's daughter, had inherited the family's distinctive coloring along with her grandmother's fierce spirit. "There's my little flame," Eleanor said, scooping up the child. "Are you being good for your mama?" "Mostly," Elizabeth said with a grin that suggested otherwise. "Uncle Thomas said he'd teach me to make nails if I sit still during your speech." "Bribery already," Daniel laughed. "She's definitely a Ryder." The town hall was packed to overflowing. It seemed everyone in the valley had come to witness this historic moment. Eleanor saw so many familiar faces. Sarah Morrison, gray-haired now but still formidable. Tom Martinez, bent with age but his eyes still sharp. Wilfred Hargrave, remarried now to a widow from Denver who'd softened his edges considerably. Robert and Julia Pinkerton with their 6 children. Mrs. Patterson, 90 if she was a day but still sitting ramrod straight. The current mayor, Jacob Thornton, son of the banker who'd once defended Eleanor, stood at the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today for a momentous occasion. 21 years ago, a young woman arrived in our town and faced rejection for nothing more than the color of her hair. That rejection, as we all now know, was the greatest gift Willow Creek ever received. Applause rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt Daniel's hand squeeze hers. Eleanor Ryder has served our community as business advisor, financial counselor, and unofficial town manager for 2 decades, Mayor Thornton continued. She's overseen our transformation from frontier outpost to thriving city. She's ensured fair wages, established our school system, created programs for widows and orphans, and proven time and again that the content of one's character matters far more than the color of one's hair. More applause, and Eleanor saw young Elizabeth clapping enthusiastically, her red curls bouncing. Therefore, it is my honor to officially appoint Eleanor McKenna Ryder as special advisor to the mayor's office and honorary deputy mayor of Willow Creek, the first woman to hold such a position in the Wyoming Territory. The crowd erupted. Eleanor stood on shaking legs, making her way to the podium. As she looked out at the sea of faces, friends, family, former adversaries who'd become allies, she thought about the terrified young woman who'd stood in that dusty street, publicly rejected and humiliated. "Thank you," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. 21 years ago, I came to Willow Creek expecting to find a husband and a quiet life. Instead, I found rejection that felt like the end of the world. She paused, finding Wilfred in the crowd. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the past. But that rejection led me to Daniel Ryder, who saw my red hair not as a curse but as a flame, who offered me work when I had nothing, respect when others offered only suspicion, and love when I'd resigned myself to mere survival. Her voice strengthened as she continued. Willow Creek taught me that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the worst disasters. That a community isn't built on perfection, but on the choice to see potential where others see only problems. Each of you has been part of this journey. You've shown me that strength isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to continue despite it. She looked at her family. Daniel standing proud, James holding Margaret's hand, Anna with tears in her eyes, Thomas trying to look grown up at 15, little Elizabeth waving from her father's shoulders. People ask me if I regret coming west for a marriage that never happened. How could I regret the path that gave me a loving husband, 5 beautiful children, grandchildren who carry forward our legacy, and a community that has become our extended family? How could I regret the rejection that redirected my entire life towards something infinitely better than what I'd planned? The speech continued, but Eleanor's mind drifted to a conversation she'd had with Daniel just that morning. A letter had arrived from Boston, from her cousin Mary's daughter, seeking advice. The young woman had been rejected by her fiancé for what he called unladylike ambition. She wanted to pursue a career in medicine. "Tell her to come here," Daniel had said immediately. "Doc Morrison's been looking for an apprentice, and he doesn't care about gender as long as the person can do the work." It was another circle, Eleanor thought. Another rejection that might become a redirection towards something better. After the ceremony, as people milled about offering congratulations, Eleanor found herself standing with Sarah Morrison by the window, looking out at the bustling street. "You know what I love most about this view?" Sarah asked. "What's that?" "I can count at least 6 businesses run by women, 3 interracial families that no one blinks at anymore, and a school where girls learn mathematics alongside boys." That's your legacy, Eleanor. Not the financial success or the political recognition, but the change in how this town sees possibility. Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion erupted near the door. A young woman had entered, travel-worn, frightened, with distinctive auburn hair that marked her as another target for old prejudices. She clutched a carpetbag and a letter, looking lost. "I'm looking for Mrs. Eleanor Ryder," she said hesitantly. "I'm Catherine Marshall from Boston." "Mary's daughter. You wrote that I should come." Eleanor moved forward immediately, remembering her own arrival, her own fear. "Catherine, welcome to Willow Creek. Come, let's get you settled. Sarah, this is the young woman I mentioned who wants to study medicine." Sarah's face lit up. "Excellent. James has been desperate for help. When can you start?" As Eleanor led Catherine out, with Sarah already making plans and Daniel appearing to carry the young woman's bag, she caught sight of their reflection in a window. 3 generations of women, Sarah with her silver hair, Eleanor with her red and silver mix, and Catherine with her auburn waves, walking together toward a future that would have been impossible just decades before. That evening, the Ryder house overflowed with people. Catherine had been installed in Anna's old room, as Anna now lived in the apartment above the shop while she learned the business. The dining room table, built by Daniel to seat 12, was packed with family and friends. "Tell the story, Grandmama," Elizabeth demanded, as she did every family gathering. "Which story, little flame?" "The real one. Not the fairy tale version you tell the little kids, the one with the bad parts too." Eleanor glanced at Daniel, who nodded encouragingly. Elizabeth was old enough for truth now. "Very well," Eleanor began, her voice taking on the cadence of a master storyteller. 21 years ago, I was a desperate young woman. My parents had died. I had no money, no prospects, and no hope except letters from a stranger promising marriage and security. I sold everything, traveled 2,000 miles, and stepped off a stagecoach to meet a man who took one look at my red hair and declared me cursed. "Wilfred Hargrave was a fool," someone muttered. It might have been Wilfred himself, who'd arrived late with his family. "He was a man of his time," Eleanor corrected gently, "bound by superstitions and fears that seem silly now, but were very real then. His rejection devastated me. I stood in that street with $17 to my name, no way home, and no plan except survival." She continued the story, but this time included details she usually omitted. The night she'd cried herself to sleep in the hotel, the hunger when her money ran low, the fear that Daniel's kindness might come with expectations she couldn't meet, the terror when Marshall Crawford arrived with his accusations. "You were brave, Grandmama," Elizabeth said solemnly. "I was terrified," Eleanor corrected. "But I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to continue despite the fear. Your grandfather taught me that." "I learned it from you," Daniel interjected. "The way you faced down Wilfred, the town's prejudice, everything life threw at you. That was real courage." "We learned from each other," Eleanor said, reaching for his hand across the table. "That's what partnership is." As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself on the porch with Catherine, the young woman clearly overwhelmed by the warm chaos of the Ryder household. "It's not what I expected," Catherine admitted. "Aunt Mary's letters made it sound like you'd found a fairy tale." "This is messier, but better somehow." "Life is messy," Eleanor agreed. "Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. The trick is finding people willing to wade through the mess with you." "Were you really rejected for your hair color?" Catherine asked, touching her own auburn locks self-consciously. "I was. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me, though I couldn't see it at the time." Eleanor studied the young woman. "Just like your fiancé rejecting you for your ambition might be the best thing for you. How can rejection ever be good?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Because rejection is often redirection. That man showed you who he really was, someone who would diminish your dreams to maintain his comfort. Would you really want to spend your life pretending to be less than you are?" "No," Catherine said firmly. "No, I wouldn't." "Then his rejection freed you to find something better, someone better. Or maybe to find that you don't need someone at all, that you're complete on your own." Eleanor smiled. "Though I do hope you find what I found, a partner who sees your fire as warmth, not danger." The weeks that followed Catherine's arrival reminded Eleanor viscerally of her own early days in Willow Creek. The young woman faced the same suspicious looks, the same whispered speculation about why an unmarried woman would travel so far alone. But she also found the same unexpected champions. Sarah Morrison became her fierce advocate. Daniel treated her with the same protective respect he'd shown Eleanor, and the younger generation, led by Anna and James, embraced her immediately. "History rhymes," Daniel observed one evening as they watched Catherine working with Dr. Morrison through their bedroom window. She was bandaging a cowboy's arm with steady, confident hands. "What do you mean?" "Same song, different verse. A red-haired woman comes to town, faces prejudice, finds her strength, changes everything around her." He pulled Eleanor close. "Though I hope she doesn't marry the blacksmith. Thomas has his eye on her, and I'd hate to have to compete with my own son." Eleanor laughed. Thomas is 15. Catherine's 22. I'm thinking long term, Daniel said with a grin. That boy's been following her around like a puppy since she arrived. He's following Dr. Morrison, Eleanor corrected. He wants to learn medicine too. Convenient that the pretty medical student is always there then. They fell into comfortable silence, watching the town settle into evening. The electric streetlights flickered on, still a marvel even after a year, casting pools of yellow light that made the familiar streets look almost magical. Do you ever think about how different our lives would have been? Daniel asked suddenly. If Wilfred had accepted you. Eleanor considered it. I'd probably be dead, she said matter-of-factly. Or wish I was. Can you imagine? Married to a man who saw me as property, who would have crushed every independent thought, every ambition? I'd have withered away like a plant without sun. And I'd still be alone in my shop, Daniel added, working myself to death to avoid thinking about Margaret and the baby. We saved each other, didn't we? We did, Eleanor agreed, though it didn't feel like salvation at the time. A knock at their door interrupted their reverie. James stood there, his face troubled. Pa, Ma, we've got a problem. There's a group of men at the saloon, newcomers from the railroad camp. They're stirring up trouble about Catherine, saying awful things about her and any man who defends her. Daniel's face darkened. How many? 6, maybe 7. They're drunk and getting drunker. Eleanor stood. We're not doing this again. Not 20 years later. Not in our town. Eleanor, Daniel warned, but she was already moving, that familiar fire lighting in her eyes. She found the men exactly where James had said, holding court in the saloon, their voices carrying into the street. The leader, a burly man with scarred hands, was mid-tirade. Bad enough this town lets women pretend to be doctors, he was saying. But a red-haired witch? Everyone knows what kind of woman has hair like that. The kind that runs this town, Eleanor said clearly from the doorway. The saloon went silent. Eleanor walked in, and she wasn't alone. Daniel flanked her on one side, James on the other. Behind them came Tom Martinez's son, Robert and Julia Pinkerton, even Wilfred Hargrave. Within moments, it seemed half the town had crowded in or around the saloon. The stranger looked uncertain now, his bravado faltering. Who are you? Eleanor Ryder, the red-haired witch who's been deputy mayor of this town for all of a month. Also the woman who controls the credit lines for every business in 50 miles, including the suppliers for your railroad camp. She stepped closer, and though the man towered over her, he stepped back. You have 2 choices. You can apologize to Miss Marshall and leave town tonight, or you can stay and find out what happens when you threaten one of our own. You can't threaten us, one of the other men blustered. I'm not threatening, Eleanor said calmly. I'm explaining consequences. Your camp needs supplies. Those supplies come through businesses I help manage. Your boss, Mr. Henderson, owes our bank considerable money for the land leases. One word from me, and those leases get called in. She let that sink in, then continued. But more importantly, you've insulted not just Miss Marshall, but every red-haired woman, every woman who's dared to be more than decoration, every person in this town who's fought for the right to be judged by their character rather than their appearance. This is ridiculous, the leader spat. You're just a woman. Just a woman who survived rejection, built a business empire, raised 5 children, and helped transform a frontier outpost into a thriving city, Sarah Morrison said, stepping forward. Just a woman who could buy and sell you 10 times over. Just a woman who has the loyalty of every person in this room, Tom Martinez's son added, and we've all got very good memories for faces. The strangers looked around, seeing the unified front against them. This wasn't one woman they were facing, but an entire community that had learned over 20 years that Eleanor Ryder's red hair was a banner to rally behind, not a mark to fear. We'll go, the leader finally said, his voice sullen. And the apology, Eleanor prompted. The man's jaw clenched, but he turned to Catherine, who'd appeared in the doorway. Sorry, miss, no offense meant. Offense very much meant, Catherine replied steadily. But apology accepted if you leave now. They did, quickly and without further comment. As their horses' hoofbeats faded into the distance, the saloon erupted in celebration. Eleanor found herself passed from embrace to embrace, everyone wanting to share the moment. That was magnificent, Catherine breathed, her eyes shining. You face them down without violence, without lowering yourself to their level. 20 years of practice, Eleanor replied, though I had considerably less backup the first time. You had me, Daniel said, pulling her close. I had you, Eleanor agreed. That was enough then. This, she gestured to the crowd of supporters, this is better. Later that night, after the excitement had died down and the house was quiet, Eleanor sat brushing her hair, still vibrant red despite the silver threads, still long and thick despite the years. Daniel watched from their bed, his expression soft. You were magnificent tonight, he said. You've always been magnificent, but tonight, you wore your power like a crown. Power, Eleanor mused, setting down the brush. 21 years ago, I had no power at all, just desperation and $17. You had power, Daniel disagreed. You just didn't know it yet. The power to endure, to transform, to inspire. You changed this entire town just by being yourself. We changed this town, Eleanor corrected, joining him in bed. Together. Together, Daniel agreed, pulling her close. Through their window, the lights of Willow Creek spread out like a constellation. The town slept peacefully, secure in its prosperity and community. In the morning, there would be new challenges. Catherine would begin her formal medical training. Thomas would probably continue his obvious courtship despite the age difference. The railroad would bring new strangers with new prejudices to overcome. But tonight, Eleanor Ryder, rejected mail-order bride turned deputy mayor, red-haired witch turned beloved matriarch, lay in the arms of the blacksmith who'd seen her truly from the beginning. Around them, their house held the echoes of 20 years of laughter and tears, arguments and reconciliations, the everyday chaos of a life fully lived. Tell me something, Daniel said into the darkness. If you could go back knowing everything that would happen, would you still get on that stagecoach? Eleanor thought about the young woman she'd been, grieving, desperate, clutching at the promise of security through marriage to a stranger. That woman couldn't have imagined this life, this love, this legacy. Yes, she said firmly. 1,000 times yes. Every moment of pain was worth it to get here. Even Wilfred's rejection? Especially Wilfred's rejection. How else would I have found you? Daniel kissed her forehead, her cheek, her lips. Gentle kisses that spoke of decades of love, of passion mellowed but not diminished by time. I love you, Eleanor Ryder, he murmured. I love your red hair and your fierce spirit and your brilliant mind. I love the woman you were, the woman you are, and the woman you're still becoming. Still becoming? Eleanor laughed softly. At 43? Always becoming, Daniel said seriously. That's what I love most about you. You never stop growing, never stop fighting, never stop burning brighter than the sun. Eleanor thought about those words as sleep began to claim her, burning brighter than the sun. It had been Daniel's first real compliment to her, spoken to a crowd of strangers when she'd stood rejected and alone. Now it was a truth acknowledged by an entire town, a legacy passed to her children and grandchildren, a light that would continue long after she was gone. The next morning brought unexpected news. A telegram from the governor's office. They'd heard about the incident with the railroad workers and Eleanor's handling of it. The governor himself was coming to Willow Creek, bringing with him a proposal for Eleanor to join the Territorial Advisory Board, helping to shape policy for all of Wyoming. It's a great honor, Mayor Thornton said, having delivered the telegram personally. You'd be the first woman on the board. Eleanor looked at the telegram, then at Daniel, who was trying unsuccessfully to hide his pride. What do you think? I think you've been shaping policy unofficially for 20 years, Daniel said. Might as well get recognized for it. It would mean travel. Meetings in Cheyenne. Then we'll travel together when we can, and I'll hold down the fort when we can't. Daniel shrugged. We've faced worse challenges. That afternoon, Eleanor stood in the shop where it all began, watching Thomas work the forge under Daniel's supervision. The boy had his father's steady hands and patient temperament, though his interest clearly lay more in medicine than metalwork. Catherine was there too, supposedly reviewing medical texts, but obviously distracted by Thomas's presence. The cycle continues, Sarah Morrison observed, joining Eleanor. Young people finding their paths, discovering love in unexpected places. Thomas is too young for her, Eleanor said, though without much conviction. For now, Sarah agreed, but time has a way of evening things out. You know that better than anyone. Eleanor did know. Time had transformed everything. The frightened girl into a confident woman, the grieving blacksmith into a loving patriarch, the hostile town into a welcoming community. Time had turned rejection into redirection, pain into purpose, a curse into a blessing. That evening, the governor arrived with his entourage, and Willow Creek put on its finest display. A dinner at the hotel now expanded into an elegant establishment that could rival anything in Denver. Speeches from prominent citizens, all praising Eleanor's contributions. A presentation from the school children, including little Elizabeth, who read a poem about her grandmother's red hair with theatrical enthusiasm. Through it all, Eleanor felt Daniel's presence. Solid, supportive, proud. He'd never needed recognition or power, content to work his forge and raise his family. But he'd never begrudged Eleanor her wider ambitions, never felt diminished by her success. It was, she reflected, exactly the partnership she'd never known to dream of when she'd answered that mail-order bride advertisement. The governor, a distinguished man with shrewd eyes, pulled Eleanor aside after dinner. "I've heard your story, Mrs. Ryder." Rejected bride to deputy mayor. "It's quite inspiring. It's a story of community, Governor, of what's possible when people choose courage over fear." "Indeed. That's why I want you on the advisory board. Wyoming is changing, Mrs. Ryder. We need voices like yours, people who understand that progress doesn't mean abandoning values, but expanding them." Eleanor accepted, of course. How could she not? It was another circle completing itself, the woman rejected for the color of her hair, now helping to shape laws that would protect others from such discrimination. As the celebration continued around them, Eleanor and Daniel slipped away, walking through the streets of the town they'd helped build. They passed the blacksmith shop, now dark and quiet, but still the heart of their empire. They passed the church where they'd married, the school where their children had learned, the cemetery where they'd buried friends who'd become family. "No regrets?" Daniel asked, their old ritual. "Not a single one," Eleanor replied, their traditional response. But then she stopped, turning to face him in the moonlight. "Actually, that's not true. I have one regret." Daniel's face showed concern. "What?" "I regret that we only get one lifetime together. It doesn't seem like enough." Daniel's expression softened into something so tender it made Eleanor's heart ache with love even after all these years. "Then we'd better make the most of the time we have." They walked home hand in hand, two people who'd found each other through rejection and pain, who'd built something beautiful from the ashes of what was supposed to be, who'd proven that sometimes the worst moments in our lives are just preparation for the best. As they reached their house, Eleanor turned back to look at Willow Creek one more time. Somewhere out there, Catherine was probably studying late into the night, determined to prove herself worthy of the chance she'd been given. Somewhere, Thomas was probably dreaming of a future that combined medicine and marriage to an auburn-haired doctor. Somewhere, another rejected soul might be gathering courage to board a stagecoach, to take a chance on an uncertain future. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked. "That every ending is also a beginning," Eleanor replied. "That my story, our story, is part of something larger. Each person who comes here seeking a second chance adds another thread to the tapestry." "Very poetic," Daniel teased gently. "Very true," Eleanor countered. 21 years ago, a merchant rejected me for my red hair. That rejection brought me to you, brought us our children, brought prosperity to this town. Now another red-haired woman has come, fleeing another rejection, and who knows what her presence will bring. "More chaos, probably," Daniel said with a laugh. "Red-haired women seem to specialize in that." Eleanor elbowed him playfully, but she was laughing too. Chaos and change, growth and transformation, fire and forge. They went inside, to their bed, to the life they'd built together. Outside, Willow Creek slept peacefully, unaware that its story was far from over, that new chapters were being written with each sunrise, each arrival, each choice to see beauty where others saw only strangeness. And in the governor's mansion in Cheyenne, a letter was being written, appointing Eleanor McKenna Ryder to the Wyoming Territorial Advisory Board, the first woman to hold such a position. The letter noted her qualifications, her business acumen, her community leadership, her moral courage. But it didn't mention what everyone in Willow Creek knew to be her greatest qualification. She was living proof that rejection could be the greatest gift, that the things that make us different make us valuable, and that a woman with red hair that burned brighter than the sun could light the way for others finding their path through darkness. The letter would arrive in 3 days. It would change Eleanor's life again, expanding her influence beyond Willow Creek to the entire territory. But tonight, she slept peacefully in her husband's arms, her red hair spread across the pillow like a banner of victory, unaware that her story was about to inspire changes that would ripple across the American West for generations to come.